public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Recording by Cynthia Lyons, Naperville, Illinois. Preface to the first edition. A few months ago, on a public occasion, a chancery judge had the kindness to inform me, as one of a company of some 150 men and women not laboring under any suspicions of lunacy, that the Court of Chancery, though the shining subject of much popular prejudice, at which point I thought the judge's eye had a cast in my direction, was almost immaculate. There had been, he admitted, a trivial blemish or so in its rate of progress, but this was exaggerated, and had been entirely owing to the parsimony of the public, which guilty public, it appeared, had been until lately bent in the most determined manner on by no means enlarging the number of chancery judges appointed, I believe by Richard II, but any other king will do as well. This seemed to me too profound a joke to be inserted in the body of this book, or I should have restored it to Conversation Kenji or to Mr. Vholes, with one or other of whom I think it must have originated. In such mouths I might have coupled it with an apt quotation from one of Shakespeare's sonnets. My nature is subdued to what it works in, like the dyer's hand. Pity me, then, and wish I were renewed. But as it is wholesome that the parsimonious public should know what has been doing and still is doing in this connection, I mention here that everything set forth in these pages concerning the Court of Chancery is substantially true and within the truth. The case of Gridley is in no essential altered from one of actual occurrence, made public by a disinterested person who was professionally acquainted with the whole of the monstrous wrong from beginning to end. At the present moment there is a suit before the court which was commenced nearly 20 years ago, in which from 30 to 40 counsel have been known to appear at one time, in which costs have been incurred to the amount of £70,000, which is a friendly suit, and which is, I am assured, no nearer to the termination now than when it was begun. There is another well-known suit in Chancery, not yet decided, which was commenced before the close of the last century, and in which more than double the amount of £70,000 has been swallowed up in costs. If I wanted other authorities for Jarndyce and Jarndyce, I could rain them on these pages, to the shame of a parsimonious public. There is only one other point on which I offer a word of remark. The possibility of what is called spontaneous combustion has been denied since the death of Mr. Crook, and my good friend, Mr. Lewis, quite mistaken, as he soon found, in supposing the thing to have been abandoned by all authorities, published some ingenious letters to me at the time when that event was chronicled, arguing that spontaneous combustion could not possibly be. I have no need to observe that I do not wilfully or negligently mislead my readers, and that before I wrote that description I took pains to investigate the subject. There are about 30 cases on record, of which the most famous, that of the Countess Cornelia de Bandi Cesenati, was minutely investigated and described by Giuseppe Bianchini, a prebendary of Verona, otherwise distinguished in letters, who published an account of it at Verona in 1731, which he afterwards republished at Rome. The appearances beyond all rational doubt observed in that case are the appearances observed in Mr. Crook's case. The next most famous instance happened at Rheims 6 years earlier, and the historian in that case is Le Cat, one of the most renowned surgeons produced by France. The subject was a woman whose husband was ignorantly convicted of having murdered her, but on solemn appeal to a higher court he was acquitted, because it was shown upon the evidence that she had died the death to which this name of spontaneous combustion is given. I do not think it necessary to add to these notable facts, and that general reference to the authorities which will be found at page 329, the recorded opinions and experiences of distinguished medical professors, French, English, and Scotch, in more modern days, contenting myself with observing that I shall not abandon the facts until there shall have been a considerable spontaneous combustion of the testimony on which human occurrences are usually received. In Bleak House I have purposely dwelt upon the romantic side of familiar things. I believe I have never had so many readers as in this book. May we meet again. London, August 1853. Chapter 1. In Chancery. London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. Implacable November weather. As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth. And it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill, smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes, gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Dogs undistinguishable in mire, horses scarcely better, splashed to their very blinkers, foot passengers jostling one another's umbrellas in a general infection of ill temper, and losing their foothold at street corners, where tens of thousands of other foot passengers have been slipping and sliding since the day broke, if this day ever broke, adding new deposits to the crust upon crust of mud, sticking at those points tenaciously to the pavement, and accumulating at compound interest. Fog everywhere. Fog up the river, where it flows among green aits and meadows. Fog down the river, where it rolls defiled among the tiers of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city. Fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights, fog creeping into the cabooses of collier brigs, fog lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships, fog drooping on the gunwales of barges and small boats, fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners, wheezing by the firesides of their wards, fog in the stem and bowl of the afternoon pipe of the wrathful skipper down in his close cabin, fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of his shivering little prentice boy on deck, chance people on the bridges peeping over the parapets into a nether sky of fog, with fog all round them, as if they were up in a balloon and hanging in the misty clouds. Gas looming through the fog in divers places in the streets, much as the sun may, from the spongy fields, be seen to loom by husbandman and ploughboy. Most of the shops lighted 2 hours before their time, as the gas seems to know, for it has a haggard and unwilling look. The raw afternoon is rawest, and the den is densest, and the muddy streets are muddiest, near that leaden-headed old obstruction, appropriate ornament for the threshold of a leaden-headed old corporation, Temple Bar. And hard by Temple Bar, in Lincoln's Inn Hall, at the very heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor in his High Court of Chancery. Never can there come fog too thick, never can there come mud and mire too deep, to assort with the groping and floundering condition which this High Court of Chancery, most pestilent of hoary sinners, holds this day in the sight of heaven and earth. On such an afternoon, if ever, the Lord High Chancellor ought to be sitting here, as here he is, with a foggy glory round his head, softly fenced in with crimson cloth and curtains, addressed by a large advocate with great whiskers, a little voice, and an interminable brief, and outwardly directing his contemplation to the lantern in the roof, where he can see nothing but fog. On such an afternoon, some score of members of the High Court of Chancery Bar ought to be, as here they are, mistily engaged in one of the 10,000 stages of an endless cause, tripping one another up on slippery precedents, groping knee-deep in technicalities, running their goat-hair and horsehair-watered heads against walls of word, and making a pretense of equity with serious faces, as players might. On such an afternoon, the various solicitors in the cause, some 2 or 3 of whom have inherited it from their fathers, and who made a fortune by it, ought to be, as are they not, ranged in a line in a long matted well, but you might look in vain for truth at the bottom of it, between the registrar's red table and the silk gowns, with bills, cross-bills, answers, rejoinders, injunctions, affidavits, issues, references to masters' reports, mountains of costly nonsense piled before them. Well may the court be dim, with wasting candles here and there. Well may the fog hang heavy in it, as if it would never get out. Well may the stained glass windows lose their colour and admit no light of day into the place. Well may the uninitiated from the streets, who peep in through the glass panes in the door, be deterred from entrance by its owlish aspect, and by the drawl languidly echoing to the roof from the padded dais, where the Lord High Chancellor looks into the lantern that has no light in it, and where the attendant wigs are all stuck in a fog bank. This is the Court of Chancery, which has its decaying houses and its blighted lands in every shire, which has its worn-out lunatic in every madhouse, and its dead in every churchyard, which has its ruined suitor with his slipshod heels and threadbare dress, borrowing and begging through the round of every man's acquaintance, which gives to moneyed might the means abundantly of wearying out the right, which so exhausts finances, patience, courage, hope, so overthrows the brain and breaks the heart, that there is not an honourable man among its practitioners who would not give, who does not often give, the warning, suffer any wrong that can be done you, rather than come here. Who happened to be in the Lord Chancellor's court this murky afternoon, besides the Lord Chancellor, the counsel in the cause, 2 or 3 counsel who are never in any cause, and the well of solicitors before mentioned? There is the registrar below the judge in wig and gown, and there are 2 other maces, or petty bags, or privy purses, or whatever they may be, in legal court suits. These are all yawning, for no crumb of amusement ever falls from Jarndyce and Jarndyce, the cause in hand, which was squeezed dry years ago upon years ago. The shorthand writers, the reporters of the court, and the reporters of the newspapers invariably decamp with the rest of the regulars when Jarndyce and Jarndyce comes on. Their places are a blank. Standing on a seat at the side of the hall, the better to peer into the curtained sanctuary, is a little mad old woman in a squeezed bonnet, who is always in court, from its sitting to its rising, and always expecting some incomprehensible judgment to be given in her favour. Some say she really is or was a party to the suit, but no one knows for certain, because no one cares. She carries some small litter in a reticule which she calls her documents, principally consisting of paper matches and dry lavender. A sallow prisoner has come up in custody for the half-dozenth time to make a personal application to purge himself of his contempt, which, being a solitary surviving executor who has fallen into a state of conglomeration about accounts of which it is not pretended that he had ever any knowledge, he is not at all likely ever to do. In the meantime, his prospects in life are ended. Another ruined suitor, who periodically appears from Shropshire and breaks out into efforts to address the Chancellor at the close of the day's business, and who can by no means be made to understand that the Chancellor is legally ignorant of his existence after making it desolate for a quarter of a century, plants himself in a good place and keeps an eye on the judge, ready to call out, "My lord," in a voice of sonorous complaint, on the instant of his rising. A few lawyers' clerks and others who know this suitor by sight linger on the chance of his furnishing some fun and enlivening the dismal weather a little. Jarndyce and Jarndyce drones on. This scarecrow of a suit has, in course of time, become so complicated that no man alive knows what it means. The parties to it understand at least, but it has been observed that no two Chancery lawyers can talk about it for 5 minutes without coming to a total disagreement as to all the premises. Innumerable children have been born into the cause. Innumerable young people have married into it. Innumerable old people have died out of it. Scores of persons have deliriously found themselves made parties in Jarndyce and Jarndyce without knowing how or why. Whole families have inherited legendary hatreds with the suit. The little plaintiff or defendant, who was promised a new rocking horse when Jarndyce and Jarndyce should be settled, has grown up, possessed himself of a real horse, and trotted away into the other world. Fair wards of court have faded into mothers and grandmothers. A long procession of chancellors has come in and gone out. The legion of bills in the suit have been transformed into mere bills of mortality. There are not 3 Jarndyces left on the earth, perhaps, since old Tom Jarndyce, in despair, blew his brains out at a coffee-house in Chancery Lane. But Jarndyce and Jarndyce still drags its dreary length before the court, perennially hopeless. Jarndyce and Jarndyce has passed into a joke. That is the only good that ever has come of it. It has been death to many, but it is a joke in the profession. Every master in Chancery has had a reference out of it. Every chancellor was in it for somebody or other when he was counsel at the bar. Good things have been said about it by blue-nosed, bulbous-shoed old benchers in select port wine committee after dinner in hall. Articled clerks have been in the habit of fleshing their legal wit upon it. The last Lord Chancellor handled it neatly when, correcting Mr. Blowers in the eminent silk gown, who said that such a thing might happen when the sky rained potatoes, he observed, "Or when we get through Jarndyce and Jarndyce, Mr. Blowers," a pleasantry that particularly tickled the maces, bags, and purses. How many people out of the suit Jarndyce and Jarndyce has stretched forth its unwholesome hand to spoil and corrupt would be a very wide question. From the master, upon whose impaling files reams of dusty warrants in Jarndyce and Jarndyce have grimly writhed into many shapes, down to the copying clerk in the 6 clerks' office, who has copied his tens of thousands of Chancery folio pages under that eternal heading. No man's nature has been made the better by it. In trickery, evasion, procrastination, spoliation, botheration, under false pretenses of all sorts, there are influences that can never come to good. The very solicitors' boys who have kept the wretched suitors at bay by protesting time out of mind that Mr. Chisel, Mizzle, or otherwise, was particularly engaged and had appointments until dinner, may have got an extra moral twist and shuffle into themselves out of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. The receiver in the cause has acquired a goodly sum of money by it, but has acquired too a distrust of his own mother and a contempt of his own kind. Chisel, Mizzle, and otherwise have lapsed into a habit of vaguely promising themselves that they will look into that outstanding little matter, and see what can be done for Drizzle, who is not well used, when Jarndyce and Jarndyce shall be got out of the office. Shirking and sharking in all their many varieties have been sown broadcast by the ill-fated cause, and even those who have contemplated its history from the outermost circle of such evil have been insensibly tempted into a loose way of letting bad things alone to take their own bad course, and a loose belief that if the world go wrong, it was, in some offhand manner, never meant to go right. Thus, in the midst of the mud and at the heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor in his High Court of Chancery. "Mr. Tangle," says the Lord High Chancellor, latterly something restless under the eloquence of that learned gentleman. "My lord," says Mr. Tangle. Mr. Tangle knows more of Jarndyce and Jarndyce than anybody. He is famous for it, supposed never to have read anything else since he left school. "Have you nearly concluded your argument?" "My lord, no. Variety of points. Feel it my duty to submit." "Lordship," is the reply that slides out of Mr. Tangle. "Several members of the bar are still to be heard, I believe," says the Chancellor, with a slight smile. 18 of Mr. Tangle's learned friends, each armed with a little summary of 1800 sheets, bob up like 18 hammers in a pianoforte, make 18 bows, and drop into their 18 places of obscurity. "We will proceed with the hearing on Wednesday fortnight," says the Chancellor. "For the question at issue is only a question of costs, a mere bud on the forest tree of the parent suit, and really will come to a settlement one of these days." The Chancellor rises. The bar rises. The prisoner is brought forward in a hurry. The man from Shropshire cries, "My lord," maces, bags, and purses, indignantly proclaim silence, and frown at the man from Shropshire. "In reference," proceeds the Chancellor, still on Jarndyce and Jarndyce, to the young girl. "Beg lordship's pardon, boy," says Mr. Tangle prematurely. "In reference," proceeds the Chancellor with extra distinctness, "to the young girl and boy, the two young people." Mr. Tangle crushed. "Whom I directed to be in attendance today, and who are now in my private room. I will see them, and satisfy myself as to the expediency of making the order for their residing with their uncle." Mr. Tangle on his legs again. "Beg lordship's pardon, dead." With their Chancellor looking through his double eyeglass at the papers on his desk. "Grandfather." "Beg lordship's pardon, victim of rash action, brains." Suddenly a very little counsel with a terrified bass voice arises, fully inflated, in the back settlements of the fog, and says, "Will your lordship allow me? I appear for him. He is a cousin, several times removed. I am not at the moment prepared to inform the court in what exact remove he is a cousin, but he is a cousin." Leaving this address, delivered like a sepulchral message, ringing in the rafters of the roof, the very little counsel drops, and the fog knows him no more. Everybody looks for him. Nobody can see him. "I will speak with both the young people," says the Chancellor anew, and satisfy myself on the subject of their residing with their cousin. I will mention the matter tomorrow morning when I take my seat. The Chancellor is about to bow to the bar when the prisoner is presented. Nothing can possibly come of the prisoner's conglomeration but his being sent back to prison, which is soon done. The man from Shropshire ventures another remonstrative "My lord," but the Chancellor, being aware of him, has dexterously vanished. Everybody else quickly vanishes too. A battery of blue bags is loaded with heavy charges of papers and carried off by clerks. The little mad old woman marches off with her documents. The empty court is locked up. If all the injustice it has committed and all the misery it has caused could only be locked up with it, and the whole burnt away in a great funeral pyre, why, so much the better for other parties than the parties in Jarndyce and Jarndyce. End of chapter 1. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 2. In Fashion. It is but a glimpse of the world of fashion that we want on this same miry afternoon. It is not so unlike the Court of Chancery, but that we may pass from the one scene to the other as the crow flies. Both the world of fashion and the Court of Chancery are things of precedent and usage. Oversleeping Rip Van Winkles, who have played at strange games through a deal of thundery weather, sleeping beauties, whom the night will wake one day, when all the stopped spits in the kitchen shall begin to turn prodigiously. It is not a large world, relatively even to this world of ours, which has its limits too, as your Highness shall find when you have made the tour of it, and are come to the brink of the void beyond. It is a very little speck. There is much good in it. There are many good and true people in it. It has its appointed place. But the evil of it is that it is a world wrapped up in too much jewellers' cotton and fine wool, and cannot hear the rushing of the larger worlds, and cannot see them as they circle round the sun. It is a deadened world, and its growth is sometimes unhealthy for want of air. My Lady Dedlock has returned to her house in town for a few days previous to her departure for Paris, where her ladyship intends to stay some weeks, after which her movements are uncertain. The fashionable intelligence says so, for the comfort of the Parisians, and it knows all fashionable things. To know things otherwise were to be unfashionable. My Lady Dedlock has been down at what she calls, in familiar conversation, her place in Lincolnshire. The waters are out in Lincolnshire. An arch of the bridge in the park has been sapped and sopped away. The adjacent low-lying ground, for half a mile in breadth, is a stagnant river, with melancholy trees for islands in it, and a surface punctured all over, all day long, with falling rain. My Lady Dedlock's place has been extremely dreary. The weather for many a day and night has been so wet that the trees seem wet through, and the soft loppings and prunings of the woodman's axe can make no crash or crackle as they fall. The deer, looking soaked, leave quagmires where they pass. The shot of a rifle loses its sharpness in the moist air, and its smoke moves in a tardy little cloud toward the green rise, coppice-topped, that makes a background for the falling rain. The view from my Lady Dedlock's own window is alternately a lead-coloured view and a view in Indian ink. The vases on the stone terrace in the foreground catch the rain all day, and the heavy drops fall, drip, 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 upon the broad, flagged pavement, called, from old time, the Ghost's Walk, all night. On Sundays, the little church in the park is mouldy. The oaken pulpit breaks out in a cold sweat, and there is a general smell and taste as of the ancient Dedlocks in their graves. My Lady Dedlock, who is childless, looking out in the early twilight from her boudoir at a keeper's lodge, and seeing the light of a fire upon the latticed panes, and smoke rising from the chimney, and a child, chased by a woman, running out into the rain to meet the shining figure of a wrapped-up man coming through the gate, has been put quite out of temper. My Lady Dedlock says she has been bored to death. Therefore my Lady Dedlock has come away from the place in Lincolnshire, and has left it to the rain, and the crows, and the rabbits, and the deer, and the partridges and pheasants. The pictures of the Dedlocks past and gone have seemed to vanish into the damp walls in mere lowness of spirits, as the housekeeper has passed along the old rooms, shutting up the shutters. And when they will next come forth again, the fashionable intelligence, which, like the fiend, is omniscient of the past and present, but not the future, cannot yet undertake to say. Sir Leicester Dedlock is only a baronet, but there is no mightier baronet than he. His family is as old as the hills, and infinitely more respectable. He has a general opinion that the world might get on without hills, but would be done up without Dedlocks. He would, on the whole, admit nature to be a good idea. A little low, perhaps, when not enclosed with a park fence, but an idea dependent for its execution on your great county families. He is a gentleman of strict conscience, disdainful of all littleness and meanness, and ready, on the shortest notice, to die any death you may please to mention, rather than give occasion for the least impeachment of his integrity. He is an honourable, obstinate, truthful, high-spirited, intensely prejudiced, perfectly unreasonable man. Sir Leicester is 20 years, full measure, older than my lady. He will never see 65 again, nor perhaps 66, nor yet 67. He has a twist of the gout now and then, and walks a little stiffly. He is of a worthy presence, with his light grey hair and whiskers, his fine shirt frill, his pure white waistcoat, and his blue coat with bright buttons always buttoned. He is ceremonious, stately, most polite on every occasion to my lady, and holds her personal attractions in the highest estimation. His gallantry to my lady, which has never changed since he courted her, he is the one little touch of romantic fancy in him. Indeed, he married her for love. A whisper still goes about that she had not even family, howbeit Sir Leicester had so much family that perhaps he had enough, and could dispense with any more. But she had beauty, pride, ambition, insolent resolve, and sense enough to portion out a legion of fine ladies. Wealth and station, added to these, soon floated her upward, and for years now my Lady Dedlock has been at the centre of the fashionable intelligence, and at the top of the fashionable tree. How Alexander wept when he had no more worlds to conquer, everybody knows. or has some reason to know by this time, the matter having been rather frequently mentioned. My Lady Dedlock, having conquered her world, fell not into the melting, but rather into the freezing mood. An exhausted composure, a worn-out placidity, an equanimity of fatigue not to be ruffled by interest or satisfaction, are the trophies of her victory. She is perfectly well bred. If she could be translated to heaven tomorrow, she might be expected to ascend without any rapture. She has beauty still, and if it be not in its heyday, it is not yet in its autumn. She has a fine face, originally of a character that would be rather called very pretty than handsome, but improved into classicality by the acquired expression of her fashionable state. Her figure is elegant, and has the effect of being tall. Not that she is so, but that the most is made, as the Honourable Bob Stables has frequently asserted upon oath, of all her points. The same authority observes that she is perfectly got up, and remarks in commendation of her hair especially, that she is the best groomed woman in the whole stud. With all her perfections on her head, my Lady Dedlock has come up from her place in Lincolnshire, hotly pursued by the fashionable intelligence, to pass a few days at her house in town, previous to her departure for Paris, where her ladyship intends to stay some weeks, after which her movements are uncertain. And at her house in town, upon this muddy, murky afternoon, presents himself an old-fashioned old gentleman, attorney at law, and eke solicitor of the High Court of Chancery, who has the honour of acting as legal adviser of the Dedlocks, and has as many cast-iron boxes in his office with that name outside, as if the present baronet were the coin of the conjurer's trick, and were constantly being juggled through the whole set. Across the hall, and up the stairs, and along the passages, and through the rooms, which are very brilliant in the season and very dismal out of it, fairyland to visit, but a desert to live in, the old gentleman is conducted by a Mercury in powder to my lady's presence. The old gentleman is rusty to look at, but is reputed to have made good thrift out of aristocratic marriage settlements and aristocratic wills, and to be very rich. He is surrounded by a mysterious halo of family confidences, of which he is known to be the silent depository. There are noble mausoleums rooted for centuries in retired glades of parks, among the growing timber and the fern, which perhaps hold fewer noble secrets than walk abroad among men, shut up in the breast of Mr. Tulkinghorn. He is of what is called the old school, a phrase generally meaning any school that seems never to have been young, and wears knee-breeches tied with ribbons, and gaiters or stockings. One peculiarity of his black clothes and of his black stockings, be they silk or worsted, is that they never shine. Mute, close, irresponsive to any glancing light, his dress is like himself. He never converses when not professionally consulted. He is found sometimes, speechless, but quite at home, at corners of dinner tables, in great country houses, and near doors of drawing rooms, concerning which the fashionable intelligence is eloquent, where everybody knows him, and where half the peerage stops to say, "How do you do, Mr. Tulkinghorn?" He receives these salutations with gravity, and buries them along with the rest of his knowledge. Sir Leicester Dedlock is with my lady, and is happy to see Mr. Tulkinghorn. There is an air of prescription about him which is always agreeable to Sir Leicester. He receives it as a kind of tribute. He likes Mr. Tulkinghorn's dress. There is a kind of tribute in that too. It is eminently respectable, and likewise, in a general way, retainer-like. It expresses, as it were, the steward of the legal mysteries, the butler of the legal cellar of the Dedlocks. Has Mr. Tulkinghorn any idea of this himself? It may be so, or it may be not, but there is in this remarkable circumstance to be noted in everything associated with my Lady Dedlock as one of a class, as one of the leaders and representatives of her little world. She supposes herself to be an inscrutable being, quite out of the reach and ken of ordinary mortals, seeing herself in her glass, where indeed she looks so. Yet every dim little star revolving about her, from her maid to the manager of the Italian opera, knows her weaknesses, prejudices, follies, haughtinesses, and caprices, and lives upon as accurate a calculation and as nice a measure of her moral nature as her dressmaker takes of her physical proportions. Is a new dress, a new custom, a new singer, a new dancer, a new form of jewellery, a new dwarf or giant, a new chapel, a new anything to be set up? There are deferential people in a dozen callings whom my Lady Dedlock suspects of nothing but prostration before her, who can tell you how to manage her as if she were a baby, who do nothing but nurse her all their lives, who, humbly affecting to follow with profound subservience, lead her and her whole troop after them, who in hooking one hook all and bear them off, as Lemuel Gulliver bore away the stately fleet of the majestic Lilliput. If you want to address our people, sir, say Blaze and Sparkle the jewellers, meaning by our people Lady Dedlock and the rest, you must remember that you are not dealing with the general public. You must hit our people in their weakest place, and their weakest place is such a place. To make this article go down, gentlemen, say Sheen and Gloss, the mercers, to their friends the manufacturers, you must come to us, because we know where to have the fashionable people, and we can make it fashionable. If you want to get this print upon the tables of my high connexion, says Mr. Slattery the librarian, or if you want to get this dwarf or giant into the house of my high connexion, sir, or if you want to secure to this entertainment the patronage of my high connexion, sir, you must leave it, if you please, to me, for I have been accustomed to study the leaders of my high connexion, sir, and I may tell you, without vanity, that I can turn them round my finger. In which Mr. Slattery, who is an honest man, does not exaggerate at all. Therefore, while Mr. Tulkinghorn may not know what is passing in the Dedlock mind at present, it is very possible that he may. My lady's cause has been again before the Chancellor, has it, Mr. Tulkinghorn? Says Sir Leicester, giving him his hand. Yes, it has been on again to-day, Mr. Tulkinghorn replies, making one of his quiet bows to my lady, who is on a sofa near the fire, shading her face with a hand-screen. It would be useless to ask, says my lady, with the dreariness of the place in Lincolnshire still upon her, whether anything has been done. Nothing that you would call anything has been done to-day, replies Mr. Tulkinghorn. Nor ever will be, says my lady. Sir Leicester has no objection to an interminable chancery suit. It is a slow, expensive, British, constitutional kind of thing. To be sure, he has not a vital interest in the suit in question, her part in which was the only property my lady brought him, and he has a shadowy impression that for his name, the name of Dedlock, to be in a cause, and not in the title of that cause, is a most ridiculous accident. But he regards the Court of Chancery, even if it should involve an occasional delay of justice and a trifling amount of confusion, as something devised in conjunction with a variety of other somethings by the perfection of human wisdom for the eternal settlement, humanly speaking, of everything. And he is upon the whole of a fixed opinion that to give the sanction of his countenance to any complaints respecting it would be to encourage some person in the lower classes to rise up somewhere, like Wat Tyler. As a few fresh affidavits have been put upon the file, says Mr. Tulkinghorn, and as they are short, and as I proceed upon the troublesome principle of begging leave to possess my clients with any new proceedings in a cause, cautious man, Mr. Tulkinghorn, taking no more responsibility than necessary. And further, as I see you are going to Paris, I have brought them in my pocket. Sir Leicester was going to Paris too, by the by, but the delight of the fashionable intelligence was in his lady. Mr. Tulkinghorn takes out his papers, asks permission to place them on a golden talisman of a table at my lady's elbow, puts on his spectacles, and begins to read by the light of a shaded lamp. In Chancery, between John Jarndyce. My lady interrupts, requesting him to miss as many of the formal horrors as he can. Mr. Tulkinghorn glances over his spectacles and begins again, lower down. My lady carelessly and scornfully abstracts her attention. Sir Leicester, in a great chair, looks at the fire, and appears to have a stately liking for the legal repetitions and prolixities as ranging among the national bulwarks. It happens that the fire is hot where my lady sits, and that the hand-screen is more beautiful than useful, being priceless but small. My lady, changing her position, sees the papers on the table, looks at them nearer still, asks impulsively, "Who copied that?" Mr. Tulkinghorn stops short, surprised by my lady's animation and her unusual tone. "Is that what you people call law hand?" she asks, looking full at him in her careless way again, and toying with her screen. "Not quite. Probably." Mr. Tulkinghorn examines it as he speaks. "The legal character which it has was acquired after the original hand was formed. Why do you ask?" "Anything to vary this detestable monotony. Oh, go on, do." Mr. Tulkinghorn reads again. The heat is greater. My lady screens her face. Sir Leicester dozes, starts up suddenly, and then cries, what do you say?" "I say I am afraid," says Mr. Tulkinghorn, who has risen hastily, "that Lady Dedlock is ill." "Faint," my lady murmurs with white lips. "Only that. But it is like the faintness of death. Don't speak to me. Ring, and take me to my room." Mr. Tulkinghorn retires into another chamber. Bells ring, feet shuffle and patter, silence ensues. Mercury at last begs Mr. Tulkinghorn to return. "Better now," quoth Sir Leicester, motioning the lawyer to sit down and read to him alone. I have been quite alarmed. I never knew my lady swoon before. But the weather is extremely trying, and she really has been bored to death down at our place in Lincolnshire. End of chapter 2. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 3. A Progress. I have a great deal of difficulty in beginning to write my portion of these pages, for I know I am not clever. I always knew that. I can remember, when I was a very little girl indeed, I used to say to my doll, when we were alone together, "Now, Dolly, I am not clever. You know very well, and you must be patient with me, like a dear." And so she used to sit propped up in a great armchair, with her beautiful complexion and rosy lips, staring at me, or not so much at me, I think, as at nothing, while I busily stitched away and told her every one of my secrets. My dear old doll! I was such a shy little thing that I seldom dared to open my lips, and never dared to open my heart to anybody else. It almost makes me cry to think what a relief it used to be to me, when I came home from school of a day, to run upstairs to my room and say, "Oh, you dear faithful Dolly, I knew you would be expecting me," and then to sit down on the floor, leaning on the elbow of her great chair, and tell her all I had noticed since we parted. I had always rather a noticing way, not a quick way. Oh no, a silent way of noticing what passed before me, and thinking I should like to understand it better. I have not by any means a quick understanding. When I love a person very tenderly indeed, it seems to brighten, but even that may be my vanity. I was brought up, from my earliest remembrance, like some of the princesses in the fairy stories, only I was not charming, by my godmother. At least, I only knew her as such. She was a good, good woman. She went to church 3 times every Sunday, and to morning prayers on Wednesdays and Fridays, and to lectures whenever there were lectures, and never missed. She was handsome, and if she had ever smiled, would have been, I used to think, like an angel. But she never smiled. She was always grave and strict. She was so very good herself, I thought, that the badness of other people made her frown all her life. I felt so different from her, even making every allowance for the differences between a child and a woman. I felt so poor, so trifling, and so far off that I could never be unrestrained with her. No, could never even love her as I wished. It made me very sorry to consider how good she was, and how unworthy of her I was, and I used ardently to hope that I might have a better heart, and I talked it over very often with the dear old doll, but I never loved my godmother as I ought to have loved her, and as I felt I must have loved her had I been a better girl. This made me, I dare say, more timid and retiring than I naturally was, and cast me upon Dolly as the only friend with whom I felt at ease. But something happened when I was still quite a little thing that helped it very much. I had never heard my mamma spoken of. I had never heard of my papa either, but I felt more interested about my mamma. I had never worn a black frock that I could recollect. I had never been shown my mamma's grave.
I had never been told where it was, yet I had never been taught to pray for any relation but my godmother. I had more than once approached this subject of my thoughts with Mrs. Rachel, our only servant, who took my light away when I was in bed, another very good woman, but austere to me, and she had only said, "Esther, good night," and gone away and left me. Although there were 7 girls at the neighbouring school where I was a day boarder, and although they called me little Esther Summerson, I knew none of them at home. All of them were older than I, to be sure. I was the youngest there by a good deal. But there seemed to be some other separation between us besides that, and besides their being far more clever than I was, and knowing much more than I did. One of them, in the first week of my going to the school, I remember it very well, invited me home to a little party, to my great joy. But my godmother wrote a stiff letter declining for me, and I never went. I never went out at all. It was my birthday. There were holidays at school on other birthdays, none on mine. There were rejoicings at home on other birthdays, as I knew from what I had heard the girls relate to one another. There were none on mine. My birthday was the most melancholy day at home in the whole year. I have mentioned that, unless my vanity should deceive me, as I know it may, for I may be very vain without suspecting it, though indeed I don't. My comprehension is quickened when my affection is. My disposition is very affectionate, and perhaps I might still feel such a wound, if such a wound could be received more than once, with the quickness of that birthday. Dinner was over, and my godmother and I were sitting at the table before the fire. The clock ticked, the fire clicked. Not another sound had been heard in the room or in the house, for I don't know how long. I happened to look timidly up from my stitching across the table, at my godmother, and I saw in her face, looking gloomily at me, "It would have been far better, little Esther, that you had had no birthday, that you had never been born." I broke out crying and sobbing, and I said, "Oh, dear godmother, tell me, pray do tell me, did mamma die on my birthday?" "No," she returned. "Ask me no more, child." "Oh, pray do tell me something of her. Do now, at last, dear godmother, if you please. What did I do to her? How did I lose her? Why am I so different from other children? And why is it my fault, dear godmother? No, 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 don't go away. Oh, speak to me." I was in a kind of fright beyond my grief, and I caught hold of her dress and was kneeling to her. But she had been saying all the while, "Let me go." But now she stood still. Her darkened face had such power over me that it stopped me in the midst of my vehemence. I put up my trembling little hand to clasp hers, or to beg her pardon with what earnestness I might, but withdrew it as she looked at me, and laid it on my fluttering heart. She raised me, sat in her chair, and standing me before her, said slowly, in a cold, low voice, I see her knitted brow and pointed finger, "Your mother, Esther, is your disgrace, and you were hers. The time will come, and soon enough, when you will understand this better, and will feel it too, as no one save a woman can. I have forgiven her." But her face did not relent. "The wrong she did to me, and I say no more of it, though it was greater than you will ever know, than anyone will ever know, but I, the sufferer. For yourself, unfortunate girl, orphaned and degraded from the first of these evil anniversaries, pray daily that the sins of others be not visited upon your head, according to what is written. Forget your mother, and leave all other people to forget her, who will do her unhappy child that greatest kindness. Now go. She checked me, however, as I was about to depart from her, so frozen as I was, and added this: submission, self-denial, diligent work are the preparations for a life begun with such a shadow on it. You are different from other children, Esther, because you were not born, like them, in common sinfulness and wrath. You are set apart. I went up to my room and crept to bed, and laid my doll's cheek against mine wet with tears, and holding that solitary friend upon my bosom, cried myself to sleep. Imperfect as my understanding of my sorrow was, I knew that I had brought no joy at any time to anybody's heart, and that I was no one upon earth what Dolly was to me. Dear, dear, to think how much time we passed alone together afterwards, and how often I repeated to the doll the story of my birthday, and confided to her that I would try, as hard as ever I could, to repair the fault I had been born with, of which I confessedly felt guilty and yet innocent, and would strive as I grew up to be industrious, contented, and kind-hearted, and to do some good to someone, and win some love to myself if I could. I hope it is not self-indulgent to shed these tears as I think of it. I am very thankful, I am very cheerful, but I cannot quite help their coming to my eyes. There, I have wiped them away now, and can go on again properly. I felt the distance between my godmother and myself so much more after the birthday, and felt so sensible of filling a place in her house which ought to have been empty, that I found her more difficult of approach, though I was fervently grateful to her in my heart, than ever. I felt in the same way toward my school companions. I felt in the same way towards Mrs. Rachel, who was a widow, and towards her daughter, of whom she was proud, who came to see her once a fortnight. I was very retired and quiet, and tried to be very diligent. One Sunday afternoon, when I came home from school with my books and portfolio, watching my long shadow at my side, and as I was gliding upstairs to my room as usual, my godmother looked out of the parlour door and called me back. Sitting with her, I found, which was very unusual indeed, a stranger, a portly, important-looking gentleman, dressed all in black, with a white cravat, large gold watch seals, a pair of gold eyeglasses, and a large seal ring upon his little finger. "This," said my godmother in an undertone, "is the child." Then she said, in her naturally stern way of speaking, "This is Esther, sir." The gentleman put his eyeglasses to look at me, and said, "Come here, my dear." He shook hands with me, and asked me to take off my bonnet, looking at me all the while. When I had complied, he said, "Ah," and afterwards, "Yes," and then taking off his eyeglasses, and folding them in a red case, and leaning back in his armchair, turned the case about in his two hands. He gave my godmother a nod. Upon that my godmother said, "You may go upstairs, Esther," and I made him my curtsy and left him. It must have been 2 years afterward, and I was almost 14, when one dreadful night my godmother and I sat at the fireside. I was reading aloud, and she was listening. I had come down at 9 o'clock, as I always did, to read the Bible to her, and was reading from St. John, how our Saviour stooped down, writing with his finger in the dust, when they brought the sinful woman to him. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. I was stopped by my godmother's rising, putting her hand to her head, and crying out in an awful voice from quite another part of the book. Watch ye therefore, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch. In an instant, while she stood before me repeating these words, she fell down on the floor. I had no need to cry out. Her voice had sounded through the house, and been heard in the street. She was laid upon her bed. For more than a week she lay there, little altered outwardly, with her old handsome resolute frown that I knew so well, carved upon her face. Many and many a time, in the day and in the night, with my head upon the pillow by her, that my whispers might be plainer to her, I kissed her, thanked her, prayed for her, asked her for her blessing and forgiveness, entreated her to give me the least sign that she knew or heard me. No, no, her face was immovable to the very last, and even afterwards her frown remained unsoftened. On the day after my poor good godmother was buried, the gentleman in black with the white neckcloth reappeared. I was sent for by Mrs. Rachel, and found him in the same place, as if he had never gone away. My name is Kenji, he said. You may remember it, my child. Kenji and Carboy, Lincoln's Inn. I replied that I remembered to have seen him once before. Pray be seated, here near me. Don't distress yourself. It's of no use, Mrs. Rachel. I needn't inform you who were acquainted with the late Miss Barbary's affairs, that her means die with her, and that this young lady, now her aunt is dead. My aunt, sir? It is really of no use carrying on a deception when no object is to be gained by it, said Mr. Kenji smoothly. Aunt in fact, though not in law. Don't distress yourself. Don't weep. Don't tremble, Mrs. Rachel. Our young friend has no doubt heard of the Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Never, said Mrs. Rachel. Is it possible, pursued Mr. Kenji, putting up his eyeglasses, that our young friend, I beg you won't distress yourself, never heard of Jarndyce and Jarndyce? I shook my head, wondering even what it was. Not of Jarndyce and Jarndyce? Said Mr. Kenji, looking over his glasses at me, and softly turning the case about and about, as if he were petting something. Not of one of the greatest chancery suits known? Not of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, in itself a monument of chancery practice, in which, I would say, every difficulty, every contingency, every masterly fiction, every form of procedure known in that court is represented over and over again? It is a cause that could not exist out of this free and great country. I should say that the aggregate of costs in Jarndyce and Jarndyce, Mrs. Rachel, I was afraid he addressed himself to her because I appeared inattentive, amounts at the present hour to from 60 to 70,000 pounds, said Mr. Kenji, leaning back in his chair. I felt very ignorant, but what could I do? I was so entirely unacquainted with the subject that I understood nothing about it even then. And she really never heard of the cause? Said Mr. Kenji. Surprising. Miss Barbary, sir, returned Mrs. Rachel, who is now among the seraphim. I hope so, I am sure, said Mr. Kenji politely. Wished Esther only to know what would be serviceable to her, and she knows, from any teaching she has had here, nothing more. Well, said Mr. Kenji, upon the whole very proper. Now to the point, addressing me. Miss Barbary, your sole relation. In fact, that is, for I am bound to observe that in law you had none. Being deceased, and it is naturally not being to be expected that Mrs. Rachel— Oh dear no, said Mrs. Rachel quickly. Quite so, assented Mr. Kenji. That Mrs. Rachel should charge herself with your maintenance and support. I beg you won't distress yourself. You are in a position to receive the renewal of an offer which I was instructed to make to Miss Barbary some 2 years ago, and which, though rejected then, was understood to be renewable under the lamentable circumstances that have since occurred. Now, if I avow that I represent in Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and otherwise, a highly humane, but at the same time singular man, shall I compromise myself by any stretch of my professional caution? Said Mr. Kenji, leaning back in his chair again, and looking calmly at us both. He appeared to enjoy beyond everything the sound of his own voice. I couldn't wonder at that, for it was mellow and full, and gave great importance to every word he uttered. He listened to himself with obvious satisfaction, and sometimes gently beat time to his own music with his head, or rounded a sentence with his hand. I was very much impressed by him, even then, before I knew that he formed himself on the model of a great lord, who was his client, and that he was generally called Conversation Kenji. Mr. Jarndyce, he pursued, being aware of the, I would say, desolate position of our young friend, offers to place her at a first-rate establishment, where her education shall be completed, where her comfort shall be secured, and where her reasonable wants shall be anticipated, where she shall be eminently qualified to discharge her duty in that station of life unto which it has pleased, shall I say Providence, to call her. My heart was filled so full, both by what he said and by his affecting manner of saying it, that I was not able to speak, though I tried. Mr. Jarndyce, he went on, makes no condition beyond expressing his expectation that our young friend will not at any time remove herself from the establishment in question without his knowledge and concurrence, that she will faithfully apply herself to the acquisition of those accomplishments, upon the exercise of which she will be ultimately dependent, that she will tread in the paths of virtue and honour, and so forth. I was still less able to speak than before. Now, what does our young friend say? Proceeded Mr. Kenji. Take time, take time. I pause for her reply, but take time. What the destitute subject of such an offer tried to say, I need not repeat. What she did say, I could more easily tell, if it were worth the telling. What she felt, and will feel to her dying hour, I could never relate. This interview took place at Windsor, where I had passed, as far as I knew, my whole life. on that day week, amply provided with all necessaries, I left it, inside the stagecoach, for Reading. Mrs. Rachel was too good to feel any emotion at parting, but I was not so good, and wept bitterly. I thought that I ought to have known her better after so many years, and ought to have made myself enough of a favourite with her to make her sorry then. When she gave me one cold parting kiss upon my forehead, like a thaw drop from the stone porch, it was a very frosty day. I felt so miserable and self-reproachful that I clung to her and told her it was my fault, I knew, that she could say good-bye so easily. "No, Esther," she returned, "it is your misfortune." The coach was at the little lawn gate. We had not come out until we heard the wheels, and thus I left her, with a sorrowful heart. She went in before my boxes were lifted to the coach roof, and shut the door. As long as I could see the house, I looked back at it from the window, through my tears. My godmother had left Mrs. Rachel all the little property she possessed, and there was to be a sale, and an old hearth rug with roses on it, which always seemed to me the first thing in the world I had ever seen, was hanging outside in the frost and snow. A day or two before, I had wrapped the dear old doll in her own shawl, and quietly laid her, I am half ashamed to tell it, in the garden earth, under the tree that shaded my old window. I had no companion left but my bird, and him I carried with me in his cage. When the house was out of sight, I sat, with my bird cage in the straw at my feet, forward on the low seat, to look out of the high window, watching the frosty trees that were like beautiful pieces of spar, and the fields all smooth and white with last night's snow, and the sun so red but yielding so little heat, and the ice dark like metal where the skaters and sliders had brushed the snow away. There was a gentleman in the coach who sat on the opposite seat and looked very large in a quantity of wrappings, but he sat gazing out of the other window, and took no notice of me. I thought of my dead godmother, of the night when I read to her, of her frowning so fixedly and sternly in her bed, of the strange place I was going to, of the people I should find there, and what they would be like, and what they would say to me, when a voice in the coach gave me a terrible start. It said, "What the devil are you crying for?" I was so frightened that I lost my voice, and could only answer in a whisper, "Me, sir?" For of course I knew it must have been the gentleman in the quantity of wrappings, though he was still looking out of his window. "Yes, you," he said, turning round. "I didn't know I was crying, sir," I faltered. "But you are," said the gentleman. "Look here." He came quite opposite to me from the other corner of the coach, brushed one of his large furry cuffs across my eyes, but without hurting me, and showed me that it was wet. "There, now you know you are," he said, "don't you?" "Yes, sir," I said. "And what are you crying for?" said the gentleman. "Don't you want to go there?" "Where, sir?" "Where? Why, wherever you are going," said the gentleman. "I am very glad to go there," I answered. "Well, then, look glad," said the gentleman. I thought he was very strange, or at least that what I could see of him was very strange, for he was wrapped up to the chin, and his face was almost hidden in a fur cap, with broad fur straps at the side of his head, fastened under his chin. But I was composed again, and not afraid of him. So I told him that I thought I must have been crying, because of my godmother's death, and because of Mrs. Rachel's not being sorry to part with me. "Confound Mrs. Rachel," said the gentleman. Let her fly away in a high wind on a broomstick." I began to be really afraid of him now, and looked at him with the greatest astonishment. But I thought that he had pleasant eyes, although he kept on muttering to himself in an angry manner, and calling Mrs. Rachel names. After a little while he opened his outer wrapper, which appeared to me large enough to wrap up the whole coach, and put his arm down in a deep pocket in the side. "Now look here," he said. "In this paper," which was nicely folded, "is a piece of the best plum cake that can be got for money, sugar on the outside an inch thick, like fat on mutton chops. Here's a little pie. A gem this is, both for size and quality, made in France. And what do you suppose it's made of? Livers of fat geese. There's a pie. Now let's see you eat 'em." "Thank you, sir," I replied. "Thank you very much indeed. But I hope you won't be offended. They are too rich for me." "Floored again," said the gentleman, which I didn't at all understand, and threw them both out of window. He did not speak to me any more until he got out of the coach a little way short of Reading, when he advised me to be a good girl and to be studious, and shook hands with me. I must say I was relieved by his departure. We left him at a milestone. I often walked past it afterwards, and never for a long time, without thinking of him, and half expecting to meet him. But I never did, and so, as time went on, he passed out of my mind. When the coach stopped, a very neat lady looked up at the window and said, "Miss Donny?" "No, ma'am, Esther Summerson." "That is quite right," said the lady. "Miss Donny." I now understood that she introduced herself by that name, and begged Miss Donny's pardon for my mistake, and pointed out my boxes at her request. Under the direction of a very neat maid, they were put outside a very small green carriage, and then Miss Donny, the maid, and I got inside and were driven away. "Everything is ready for you, Esther," said Miss Donny, "and the scheme of your pursuits has been arranged in exact accordance with the wishes of your guardian, Mr. Jarndyce." "Of, did you say, ma'am?" "Of your guardian, Mr. Jarndyce," said Miss Donny. I was so bewildered that Miss Donny thought the cold had been too severe for me, and lent me her smelling bottle. "Do you know my guardian, Mr. Jarndyce, ma'am?" I asked, after a good deal of hesitation. "Not personally, Esther," said Miss Donny, "merely through his solicitors, Messrs. Kenji and Carboy, of London. A very superior gentleman, Mr. Kenji. Truly eloquent indeed. Some of his periods quite majestic." I felt this to be very true, but was too confused to attend to it. Our speedy arrival at our destination, before I had time to recover myself, increased my confusion, and I never shall forget the uncertain and the unreal air of everything at Greenleaf, Miss Donny's house, that afternoon. But I soon became used to it. I was so adapted to the routine of Greenleaf before long, that I seemed to have been there a great while, and almost to have dreamed, rather than really lived, my old life at my godmother's. Nothing could be more precise, exact, and orderly than Greenleaf. There was a time for everything all round the dial of the clock, and everything was done at its appointed moment. We were 12 boarders. There were 2 Miss Donnys, twins. It was understood that I would have to depend by and by on my qualifications as a governess, and I was not only instructed in everything that was taught at Greenleaf, but was very soon engaged in helping to instruct others. Although I was treated in every other respect like the rest of the school, this single difference was made in my case from the first. As I began to know more, I taught more, and so in course of time I had plenty to do, which I was very fond of doing, because it made the dear girls fond of me. At last, whenever a new pupil came, who was a little downcast and unhappy, she was so sure, indeed I don't know why, to make a friend of me, that all newcomers were confided to my care. They said I was so gentle, but I am sure they were. I often thought of the resolution I had made on my birthday, to try to be industrious, contented, and true-hearted, and to do some good to some one, and to win some love if I could. And indeed, I felt almost ashamed to have done so little and have won so much. I passed at Greenleaf 6 happy, quiet years. I never saw in any face there, thank heaven, on my birthday, that it would have been better if I had never been born. When the day came round, it brought me so many tokens of affectionate remembrance that my room was beautiful with them from New Year's Day to Christmas. In those 6 years I had never been away, except on visits at holiday time in the neighbourhood. After the first 6 months or so, I had taken Miss Donny's advice in reference to the propriety of writing to Mr. Kenji to say that I was happy and grateful, and with her approval I had written such a letter. I had received a formal answer acknowledging its receipt, and saying, "We note the contents thereof, which shall be duly communicated to our client." After that, I sometimes heard Miss Donny and her sister mention how regular my accounts were paid, and about twice a year I ventured to write a similar letter. I always received by return of post exactly the same answer, in the same round hand, with the signature of Kenji and Carboy in another writing, which I suppose to be Mr. Kenji's. It seems so curious to me to be obliged to write all this about myself, as if this narrative were the narrative of my life. But my little body will soon fall into the background now. 6 quiet years. I find I am saying it for the second time. I had passed at Greenleaf, seeing in those around me, as it might be in a looking-glass, every stage of my own growth and change there, when one November morning I received this letter. I omit the date. Old Square, Lincoln's Inn. Madam, Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Our client, Mr. Jarndyce, being about to receive in his house, under an order of the Court of Chancery, a ward of the court in this cause, for whom he wishes to secure an eligible companion, directs us to inform you that he will be glad of your services in the aforesaid capacity. We have arranged for your being forwarded, carriage free, per 8 o'clock coach from Reading on Monday morning next, to White Horse Cellar, Piccadilly, London, where one of our clerks will be in waiting to convey you to our office as above. We are, madam, your obedient servants, Kenji and Carboy. To Miss Esther Summerson. Oh, never, never, never shall I forget the emotion this letter caused in the house. It was so tender in them to care so much for me. It was so gracious in that father who had not forgotten me, to have made my orphan way so smooth and easy, and to have inclined so many youthful natures towards me, that I could hardly bear it. Not that I would have had them less sorry, I am afraid not, but the pleasure of it, and the pain of it, and the pride and joy of it, and the humble regret of it were so blended that my heart seemed almost breaking while it was full of rapture. The letter gave me only 5 days' notice of my removal, when every minute added to the proofs of love and kindness that were given me in those 5 days, and when at last the morning came, and when they took me through all the rooms that I might see them for the last time, and when some cried, "Esther, my dear, say good-bye to me here at my bedside, where you first spoke so kindly to me," and when others asked me only to write their names, "With Esther's love," and when they all surrounded me with their parting presents, and clung to me weeping, and cried, "What shall we do when dear, dear Esther's gone?" and when I tried to tell them how forbearing and how good they had all been to me, and how I blessed and thanked them every one, what a heart I had! And when the two Miss Donneys grieved as much to part with me as the least among them, and when the maid said, "Bless you, miss, wherever you go," and when the ugly lame old gardener, who I thought had hardly noticed me in all these years, came panting after the coach to give me a little nosegay of geraniums, and told me I had been the light of his eyes, indeed the old man said so, what a heart I had then! And could I help it, if with all this, and the coming to the little school, and the unexpected sight of the poor children outside waving their hats and bonnets to me, and of a grey-haired gentleman and lady, whose daughter I had helped to teach, and at whose house I had visited, who were said to be the proudest people in all that country, caring for nothing but calling out, "Good-bye, Esther, may you be very happy," could I help it if I was quite bowed down in the coach by myself, and said, "Oh, I am so thankful, I am so thankful," many times over? But of course I soon considered that I must not take tears where I was going, after all that had been done for me. Therefore, of course, I made myself sob less, and persuaded myself to be quiet by saying very often, "Esther, now you really must. This will not do." I cheered myself up pretty well at last, though I am afraid I was longer about it than I ought to have been. And when I had cooled my eyes with lavender water, it was time to watch for London. I was quite persuaded that we were there when we were yet 10 miles off, and when we really were there, that we should never get there. However, when we began to jolt upon a stone pavement, and particularly when every other conveyance seemed to be running into us, and we seemed to be running into every other conveyance, I began to believe that we were really approaching the end of our journey. Very soon afterward we stopped. A young gentleman who had inked himself by accident addressed me from the pavement, and said, "I am from Kengie and Carboys, miss, of Lincoln's Inn." "If you please, sir," said I. He was very obliging, and as he handed me into a fly, after superintending the removal of my boxes, I asked him whether there was a great fire anywhere, for the streets were so full of dense brown smoke that scarcely anything was to be seen. "Oh dear no, miss," he said. "This is a London particular." I had never heard of such a thing. "A fog, miss," said the young gentleman. "Oh, indeed," said I. We drove slowly through the dirtiest and darkest streets that ever were seen in the world, I thought, and in such a distracting state of confusion that I wondered how the people kept their senses, until we passed into sudden quietude under an old gateway, and drove on through a silent square until we came to an odd nook in a corner, where there was an entrance up a steep, broad flight of stairs, like an entrance to a church. And there really was a churchyard, outside under some cloisters, for I saw the gravestones from the staircase window. This was Kenji and Carboy's. The young gentleman showed me through an outer office into Mr. Kenji's room. There was no one in it, and politely put an armchair for me by the fire. He then called my attention to a little looking-glass hanging from a nail on one side of the chimney-piece. "In case you should wish to look at yourself, miss, after the journey, as you're going before the Chancellor. Not that it is requisite, I am sure," said the young gentleman civilly. "Going before the Chancellor?" I said, startled for a moment. "Only a matter of form, miss," returned the young gentleman. "Mr. Kenji is in court now. He left his compliments, and would you partake of some refreshment? There were biscuits and a decanter of wine on a small table. And look over the paper," which the young gentleman gave me as he spoke. He then stirred the fire and left me. Everything was so strange, the stranger from its being night in the daytime, and candles burning with a white flame, and looking raw and cold, that I read the words in the newspaper without knowing what they meant, and found myself reading the same words repeatedly. As it was of no use going on in that way, I put the paper down, took a peep at my bonnet in the glass to see if it was neat, and looked at the room, which was not half lighted, and at the shabby dusty tables, and at the piles of writing, and at the bookcase full of the most inexpressive looking books that ever had anything to say for themselves. Then I went on thinking, and the fire went on burning, and the candles went on flickering and guttering, and there were no snuffers, until the young gentleman by and by brought a very dirty pair, for 2 hours. At last Mr. Kenji came. He was not altered, but he was surprised to see how altered I was, and appeared quite pleased. "As you are going to be the companion of the young lady who is now in the Chancellor's private room, Miss Summerson," he said, "we thought it well that you should be in attendance also. You will not be discomposed by the Lord Chancellor, I dare say." "No, sir," I said, "I don't think I shall," really not seeing on any consideration why I should be. So Mr. Kenji gave me his arm, and we went round the corner under a colonnade and in at a side door. And so we came, along a passage, into a comfortable sort of room, where a young lady and a young gentleman were standing near a great loud roaring fire. A screen was interposed between them, and they were leaning on the screen, talking. They both looked up when I came in, and I saw in the young lady, with the fire shining upon her, such a beautiful girl, with such rich golden hair, such soft blue eyes, and such a bright, innocent, trusting face. "Miss Ada," said Mr. Kenji, "this is Miss Summerson." She came to meet me with a smile of welcome and her hand extended, but seemed to change her mind in a moment and kissed me. In short, she had such a natural, captivating, winning manner that in a few minutes we were sitting in the window seat with the light of the fire upon us, talking together as free and happy as could be. What a load off my mind! It was so delightful to know that she could confide in me and like me. It was so good of her, and so encouraging to me. The young gentleman was her distant cousin, she told me, and his name Richard Carstone. He was a handsome youth with an ingenuous face and a most engaging laugh, and after she had called him up to where we sat, he stood by us in the light of the fire too, talking gaily, like a light-hearted boy. He was very young, not more than 19 then, if quite so much, but nearly 2 years older than she was. They were both orphans, and what was very unexpected and curious to me, had never met before that day. Our all three coming together for the first time in such an unusual place was a thing to talk about, and we talked about it, and the fire, which had left off roaring, winked its red eyes at us, as Richard said, like a drowsy old chancery lion. We conversed in low tone, because a full-dressed gentleman in a bag wig frequently came in and out, and when he did so, we could hear a drawling sound in the distance, which he said was one of the counsel in our case addressing the Lord Chancellor. He told Mr. Kenji that the Chancellor would be up in 5 minutes, and presently we heard a bustle and a tread of feet, and Mr. Kenji said that the court had risen, and that his lordship was in the next room. The gentleman in the bag wig opened the door almost directly, and requested Mr. Kenji to come in. Upon that we all went into the next room, Mr. Kenji first, with my darling. It is so natural to me now that I can't help writing it. And there, plainly dressed in black, and sitting in an armchair at a table near the fire, was his lordship, whose robe, trimmed with beautiful gold lace, was thrown upon another chair. He gave us a searching look as we entered, but his manner was both courtly and kind. The gentleman in the bag wig laid bundles of papers on his lordship's table, and his lordship silently selected one and turned over the leaves. "Miss Clare," said the Lord Chancellor. "Miss Ada Clare?" Mr. Kenji presented her, and his lordship begged her to sit down near him. Then he admired her, and was interested by her. Even I could see in a moment. It touched me that in the home of such a beautiful young creature should be represented by that dry official place. The Lord High Chancellor at his best appeared so poor a substitute for the love and pride of parents. "The Jarndyce in question," said the Lord Chancellor, still turning over leaves, "is Jarndyce of Bleak House." "Jarndyce of Bleak House, my lord," said Mr. Kenji. "A dreary name," said the Lord Chancellor. "But not a dreary place at present, my lord," said Mr. Kenji. "And Bleak House," said his lordship, "is in—" "Hertfordshire, my lord." "Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House is not married?" said his lordship. "He is not, my lord," said Mr. Kenji. A pause. "Young Mr. Richard Carstone is present?" said the Lord Chancellor, glancing toward him. Richard bowed and stepped forward. "Hum!" said the Lord Chancellor, turning over more leaves. "Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House, my lord," Mr. Kenji observed in a low voice, "if I may venture to remind you, your lordship, provides a suitable companion for—" "For Mr. Carstone?" I thought, but I am not quite sure, I heard his lordship say in an equally low voice, and with a smile. "For Miss Ada Clare. This is the young lady, Miss Summerson." His lordship gave me an indulgent look, and acknowledged my curtsy very graciously. "Miss Summerson is not related to any party in the cause, I think?" "No, my lord." Mr. Kenji leant over before it was quite said, and whispered. His lordship, with his eyes upon his papers, listened, nodded twice or thrice, turned over more leaves, and did not look towards me again until we were going away. Mr. Kenji now retired, and Richard with him, to where I was, near the door, leaving my pet It is so natural to me that again I can't help it. Sitting near the Lord Chancellor, with whom his lordship spoke a little apart, asking her, as she told me afterwards, whether she had well reflected on the proposed arrangement, and if she thought she would be happy under the roof of Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House, and why she thought so. Presently he rose courteously and released her, and then he spoke for a minute or two with Richard Carstone, not seated, but standing, altogether with more ease and less ceremony, as if he still knew, though he was Lord Chancellor, how to go straight to the candour of a boy. "Very well," said his lordship, aloud. "I shall make the order. Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House has chosen, so far as I may judge," and this was when he looked at me, "a very good companion for the young lady, and the arrangement altogether seems the best of which the circumstances admit." He dismissed us pleasantly, and we all went out, very much obliged to him for being so affable and polite, by which he had certainly lost no dignity, but seemed to us to have gained some. When we got under the colonnade, Mr. Kenge remembered that he must go back for a moment to ask a question, and left us in the fog, with the Lord Chancellor's carriage and servants waiting for him to come out. "Well," said Richard Carstone, "that's over, and where do we go next, Miss Summerson?" "Don't you know?" I said. "Not in the least," said he. "And don't you know, my love?" I asked Ada. "No," said she. "Don't you?" "Not at all," said I. We looked at one another, half laughing at our being like the children in the wood, when a curious little woman in a squeezed bonnet and carrying a reticule came curtsying and smiling up to us, with an air of great ceremony. "Oh," said she, "the Wards and Jarndyce! Very happy, I am sure, to have the honour. It is a good omen for youth, and hope, and beauty, when they find themselves in this place, and don't know what's come of it." "Mad!" whispered Richard, not thinking she could hear him. "Right, mad, young gentleman," she returned so quickly that he was quite abashed. "I was a ward myself. I was not mad at that time," curtsying low, and smiling between every little sentence. "I had youth and hope, I believe, beauty. It matters very little now. None of the three served or saved me. I have the honour to attend court regularly, with my documents. I expect a judgment shortly, on the day of judgment. I have discovered that the sixth seal mentioned in the Revelations is the Great Seal. It has been open a long time. Pray accept my blessing." As Ada was a little frightened, I said, to humour the poor old lady, that we were much obliged to her. "Yes," she said mincingly, "I imagine so. And here is Conversation Kenge, with his documents. How does your honourable worship do?" "Quite well, quite well. Now don't be troublesome, that's a good soul," said Mr. Kenge, leading the way back. "By no means," said the poor old lady, keeping up with Ada and me. "Anything but troublesome. I shall confer estates on both, which is not being troublesome, I trust. I expect a judgment shortly, on the day of judgment. This is a good omen for you. Accept my blessing." She stopped at the bottom of the steep, broad flight of stairs, but we looked back as we went up, and she was still there, saying, still with a curtsy and a smile between every little sentence, "Youth, and hope, and beauty, and chancery, and Conversation Kenge, ha! Pray accept my blessing." End of chapter 3.
This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to librivox.org. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 4. Telescopic Philanthropy. We were to pass the night, Mr. Kenji told us when we arrived in his room, at Mrs. Jellyby's, and then he turned to me and said he took it for granted I knew whom Mrs. Jellyby was. "I really don't, sir," I returned. "Perhaps Mr. Carstone or Miss Clare." But no, they knew nothing whatever about Mrs. Jellyby. "Indeed, Mrs. Jellyby," said Mr. Kenji, standing with his back to the fire and casting his eyes over the dusty hearth-rug as if it were Mrs. Jellyby's biography, "is a lady of very remarkable strength of character, who devotes herself entirely to the public. She has devoted herself to an extensive variety of public subjects at various times, and is at present, until something else attracts her, devoted to the subject of Africa, with a view to the general cultivation of the coffee-berry and the natives, and the happy settlement on the banks of the African rivers of our superabundant home population. Mr. Jarndyce, who is desirous to aid any work that is considered likely to be a good work, and who is much sought after by philanthropists, has, I believe, a very high opinion of Mrs. Jellyby." Mr. Kenji, adjusting his cravat, then looked at us. "And Mr. Jellyby, sir?" suggested Richard. "Ah, Mr. Jellyby," said Mr. Kenji, "is, I don't know that I can describe him to you better than by saying that he is the husband of Mrs. Jellyby." "A nonentity, sir?" said Richard, with a droll look. "I don't say that," returned Mr. Kenji gravely. "I can't say that, indeed, for I know nothing whatever of Mr. Jellyby. I never, to my knowledge, had the pleasure of seeing Mr. Jellyby. He may be a very superior man, but he is, so to speak, merged in the more shining qualities of his wife." Mr. Kenji proceeded to tell us that as the road to Bleak House would have been very long, dark, and tedious on such an evening, and as we had been travelling already, Mr. Jarndyce had himself proposed this arrangement. A carriage would be at Mrs. Jellyby's to convey us out of town early in the forenoon of to-morrow. He then rang a little bell, and the young gentleman came in. Addressing him by the name of Guppy, Mr. Kenji inquired whether Miss Summerson's boxes and the rest of the baggage had been sent round. Mr. Guppy said yes, they had been sent round, and a coach was waiting to take us round too as soon as we pleased. "Then it only remains," said Mr. Kenji, shaking hands with us, "for me to express my lively satisfaction in, good day, Miss Clare, the arrangement this day concluded, and my good-bye to you, Miss Summerson, lively hope that it will conduce to the happiness, the glad to have had the honour of making your acquaintance, Mr. Carstone, welfare, the advantage in all points of view of all concerned. Guppy, see the party safely there." "Where is there, Mr. Guppy?" said Richard as we went downstairs. "No distance," said Mr. Guppy. "Round in Tavy's Inn, you know." "I can't say I know where it is, for I come from Winchester, and I'm strange in London." "Only round the corner," said Mr. Guppy. "We just twist up Chancery Lane, and cut along Holborn, and there we are in 4 minutes' time, as near as a toucher. This is about a London particular now, ain't it, miss?" He seemed quite delighted with it on my account. "The fog is very dense indeed," said I. "Not that it affects you, though, I'm sure," said Mr. Guppy, putting up the steps. "On the contrary, it seems to do you good, miss, judging from your appearance."
I knew he meant well in paying me this compliment, so I laughed at myself for blushing at it, when he had shut the door and got upon the box. And we all three laughed and chatted about our inexperience and the strangeness of London until we turned up under an archway to our destination, a narrow street of high houses, like an oblong cistern to hold the fog. There was a confused little crowd of people, principally children, gathered about the house at which we stopped, which had a tarnished brass plate on the door, with the inscription Jellyby. "Don't be frightened," said Mr. Guppy, looking in at the coach window. "One of the young Jellybys been and got his head through the area railings." "Oh, poor child," said I. "Let me out, if you please." "Pray be careful of yourself, miss. The young Jellybys are always up to something," said Mr. Guppy. I made my way to the poor child, who was one of the dirtiest little unfortunates I ever saw, and found him very hot and frightened, and crying loudly, fixed by the neck between two iron railings, while a milkman and a beadle, with the kindest intentions possible, were endeavouring to drag him back by the legs, under a general impression that his skull was compressible by those means. As I found, after pacifying him, that he was a little boy with a naturally large head, I thought, perhaps, where his head could go, his body could follow, and mentioned that the best mode of extraction might be to push him forward. This was so favourably received by the milkman and the beadle, that he would immediately have been pushed into the area, if I had not held his pinafore, while Richard and Mr. Guppy ran down through the kitchen to catch him when he should be released. At last he was happily got down without any accident, and then he began to beat Mr. Guppy with a hoop stick in quite a frantic manner. Nobody had appeared belonging to the house, except a person in pattens, who had been poking at the child from below with a broom. I don't know with what object, and I don't think she did. I therefore supposed that Mrs. Jellyby was not at home, and was quite surprised when the person appearing in the passage without the pattens, and going up the back room on the first floor before Ada and me, announced us as "them two young ladies, Mrs. Jellyby." We passed several more children on the way up, whom it was difficult to avoid treading on in the dark, and as we came into Mrs. Jellyby's presence, one of the poor little things fell downstairs, down a whole flight, as it sounded to me, with a great noise. Mrs. Jellyby, whose face reflected none of the uneasiness which we could not help showing in our own faces, as the dear child's head recorded its passage with a bump on every stair (Richard afterwards said he counted 7, besides one for the landing), received us with perfect equanimity. She was a pretty, very diminutive, plump woman, of from 40 to 50, with handsome eyes, though they had a curious habit of seeming to look a long way off, as if, I am quoting Richard again, they could see nothing nearer than Africa. "I am very glad indeed," said Mrs. Jellyby in an agreeable voice, "to have the pleasure of receiving you. I have a great respect for Mr. Jarndyce, and no one in whom he is interested can be an object of indifference to me." We expressed our acknowledgments, and sat down behind the door, where there was a lame invalid of a sofa. Mrs. Jellyby had very good hair, but was too much occupied with her African duties to brush it. The shawl in which she had been loosely muffled dropped on to her chair when she advanced to us, and as she turned to resume her seat, we could not help noticing that her dress didn't nearly meet up the back, and that the open space was railed across with a lattice work of stay lace, like a summer house. The room, which was strewn with papers and nearly filled by a great writing table covered with similar litter, was, I must say, not only very untidy, but very dirty. We were obliged to take notice of that with our sense of sight, even while, with our sense of hearing, we followed the poor child who had tumbled downstairs, I think into the back kitchen, where somebody seemed to stifle him. But what principally struck us was a jaded and unhealthy looking, though by no means plain girl, at the writing table, who sat biting the feather of her pen and staring at us. I suppose nobody was ever in such a state of ink, and from her tumbled hair to her pretty feet, which were disfigured with frayed and broken satin slippers trodden down at heel, she really seemed to have no article of dress upon her, from a pin upward, that was in its proper condition or its right place. "You can find me, my dears," said Mrs. Jellyby, snuffing the two great office candles in tin candlesticks, which made the room taste strongly of hot tallow. The fire had gone out, and there was nothing in the grate but ashes, a bundle of wood, and a poker. "You find me, my dears, as usual, very busy, but that you will excuse. The African project at present employs my whole time. It involves me in correspondence with public bodies, and with private individuals anxious for the welfare of their species all over the country. I am happy to say it is advancing. We hope by this time next year to have from 150 to 200 healthy families cultivating coffee and educating the natives of Borrioboola Gha on the left bank of the Niger." As Ada said nothing, but looked at me, I said it must be very gratifying. "It is gratifying," said Mrs. Jellyby. "It involves the devotion of all my energies, such as they are. But that is nothing, so that it succeeds, and I am more confident of success every day. Do you know, Miss Summerson, I almost wonder that you never turned your thoughts to Africa." This application of the subject was really so unexpected to me that I was quite at a loss as to how to receive it. I hinted that the climate, "The finest climate in the world," said Mrs. Jellyby. "Indeed, ma'am." "Certainly, with precaution," said Mrs. Jellyby. "You may go into Holborn without precaution and be run over. You may go into Holborn with precaution and never be run over. Just so with Africa." I said, "No doubt," I meant as to Holborn. "If you would like," said Mrs. Jellyby, putting a number of papers towards us, "to look over some remarks on that head, and on the general subject, which have been extensively circulated, while I finish a letter I am now dictating to my eldest daughter, who is my amanuensis." The girl at the table left off biting her pen, and made a return to our recognition, which was half bashful and half sulky. "I shall then have finished for the present," proceeded Mrs. Jellyby with a sweet smile, "though my work is never done. Where are you, Caddy?" "Presents her compliments to Mr. Swallow, and begs," said Caddy. "And begs," said Mrs. Jellyby, dictating, "to inform him in reference to his letter of inquiry on the African project. No, Peepy, not on any account." Peepy, so self-named, was the unfortunate child who had fallen downstairs, who now interrupted the correspondence by presenting himself with a strip of plaster on his forehead, to exhibit his wounded knees, in which Ada and I did not know which to pity most, the bruises or the dirt. Mrs. Jellyby merely added, with the serene composure with which she said everything, "Go along, you naughty Peepy," and fixed her fine eyes on Africa again. However, as she at once proceeded with her dictation, and as I interrupted nothing by doing it, I ventured quietly to stop poor Peepy as he was going out, and to take him up to nurse. He looked very much astonished at it, and at Ada's kissing him, but soon fell fast asleep in my arms, sobbing at longer and longer intervals until he was quiet. I was so occupied with Peepy that I lost the letter in detail, though I derived such a general impression from it of the momentous importance of Africa, and the utter insignificance of all other places and things, that I felt quite ashamed to have thought so little about it. 6 o'clock, said Mrs. Jellyby, and our dinner hour is nominally, for we dine at all hours, 5. Caddy, show Miss Clare and Miss Summerson their rooms. You will like to make some change, perhaps. You will excuse me, I know, being so much occupied. Oh, that very bad child! Pray put him down, Miss Summerson. I begged permission to retain him, truly saying that he was not at all troublesome, and carried him upstairs and laid him upon my bed. Ada and I had 2 upper rooms, with a door of communication between. They were excessively bare and disorderly, and the curtain to my window was fastened up with a fork. "You would like some hot water, wouldn't you?" said Miss Jellyby, looking round for a jug with a handle to it, but looking in vain. "If it is not being troublesome," said we. "Oh, it is not the trouble," returned Miss Jellyby. "The question is, if there is any." The evening was so very cold, and the rooms had such a marshy smell, that I confess it was a little miserable, and Ada was half crying. We soon laughed, however, and were busily unpacking, when Miss Jellyby came back to say that she was sorry there was no hot water, but they couldn't find the kettle, and the boiler was out of order. We begged her not to mention it, and made all the haste we could to get down to the fire again. But the little children had come up to the landing outside, to look at the phenomenon of Peepy lying on my bed, and our attention was distracted by the constant apparition of noises and fingers, in situations of danger between the hinges of the doors. It was impossible to shut the door of either room, for my lock, with no knob to it, looked as if it wanted to be wound up, and though the handle of Ada's went round and round with the greatest smoothness, it was attended with no effect whatever on the door. Therefore I proposed to the children that they should come in and be very good at my table, and I would tell them the story of Little Red Riding Hood while I dressed, which they did, and were as quiet as mice, including Peepy, who awoke opportunely before the appearance of the wolf. When we went downstairs, we found a mug with "A present from Tunbridge Wells" on it, lighted up in the staircase window with a floating wick, and a young woman with a swelled face bound up in a flannel bandage, blowing the fire of the drawing-room, now connected by an open door with Mrs. Jellyby's room, and choking dreadfully. It smoked to that degree, in short, that we all sat coughing and crying with the windows open for half an hour, during which Mrs. Jellyby, with the same sweetness of temper, directed letters about Africa. Her being so employed was, I must say, a great relief to me, for Richard told us that he had washed his hands in a pie dish, and that they had found the kettle on his dressing-table, and he made Ada laugh so, that they made me laugh in the most ridiculous manner. Soon after 7 o'clock we went down to dinner, carefully, by Mrs. Jellyby's advice, for the stair carpets, beside being very deficient in stair wires, were so torn as to be absolute traps. We had a fine codfish, a piece of roast beef, a dish of cutlets, and a pudding, an excellent dinner, if it had had any cooking to speak, but it was almost raw. The young woman with the flannel bandage waited, and dropped everything on the table wherever it happened to go, and never moved it again until she put it on the stairs. The person I had seen in pattens, who I supposed to have been the cook, frequently came and skirmished with her at the door, and there appeared to be ill will between them. all through dinner, which was long, in consequence of such accidents as the dish of potatoes being mislaid in the coal scuttle, and the handle of the corkscrew coming off and striking the young woman in the chin, Mrs. Jellyby preserved the evenness of her disposition. She told us a great deal that was interesting about Borrioboola Gha and the natives, and received so many letters that Richard, who sat by her, saw 4 envelopes in the gravy at once. Some of the letters were proceedings of ladies' committees, or resolutions of ladies' meetings, which she read to us. Others were applications from people excited in various ways about the cultivation of coffee and natives. Others required answers, and these she sent her eldest daughter from the table 3 or 4 times to write. She was full of business, and undoubtedly was, as she had told us, devoted to the cause. I was a little curious to know who a mild bald gentleman in spectacles was, who dropped into a vacant chair (there was no top or bottom in particular) after the fish was taken away, and seemed passively to submit himself to Borrioboola Gha, but not to be actively interested in that settlement. As he never spoke a word, he might have been a native, but for his complexion. It was not until we left the table and he remained alone with Richard that the possibility of his being Mr. Jellyby ever entered my head. But he was Mr. Jellyby, and a loquacious young man called Mr. Quayle, with large shining knobs for temples and his hair brushed to the back of his head, who came in the evening and told Ada he was a philanthropist, also informed her that he called the matrimonial alliance of Mrs. Jellyby with Mr. Jellyby the union of mind and matter. This young man, besides having a great deal to say for himself about Africa, and a project of his for teaching the coffee colonists to teach the natives to turn pianoforte legs and establish an export trade, delighted in drawing Mrs. Jellyby out by saying, "I believe now, Mrs. Jellyby, you have received as many as from 150 to 200 letters respecting Africa in a single day, have you not? Or, if my memory does not deceive me, Mrs. Jellyby, you once mentioned that you had sent off 5,000 circulars from one post office at one time," always repeating Mrs. Jellyby's answer to us like an interpreter. During the whole evening, Mr. Jellyby sat in a corner with his head against the wall, as if he were subject to low spirits. It seemed that he had several times opened his mouth when alone with Richard, after dinner, as if he had something on his mind, but had always shut it again, to Richard's extreme confusion, without saying anything. Mrs. Jellyby, sitting in quite a nest of waste paper, drank coffee all the evening, and dictated at intervals to her eldest daughter. She also held a discussion with Mr. Quayle, of which the subject seemed to be, if I understood it, the brotherhood of humanity, and gave utterance to some beautiful sentiments. I was not so attentive an auditor as I might have wished to be, however, for Peepy and the other children came flocking about Ada and me in a corner of the drawing-room to ask for another story, so we sat down among them and told them in whispers Puss in Boots, and I don't know what else, until Mrs. Jellyby, accidentally remembering them, sent them to bed. As Peepy cried for me to take him to bed, I carried him upstairs, where the young woman with the flannel bandage charged into the midst of the little family like a dragon, and overturned them into cribs. After that I occupied myself in making our room a little tidy, and in coaxing a very cross fire that had been lighted to burn, which at last it did, quite brightly. On my return downstairs, I felt that Mrs. Jellyby looked down upon me rather for being so frivolous, and I was sorry for it, though at the same time I knew that I had no higher pretensions. It was nearly midnight before we found an opportunity of going to bed, and even then we left Mrs. Jellyby among her papers drinking coffee, and Miss Jellyby biting the feather of her pen. "What a strange house!" said Ada, when we got upstairs. "How curious of my cousin Jarndyce to send us here!" "My love," said I, "it quite confuses me. I want to understand it, and I can't understand it at all." "What?" said Ada, with her pretty smile. "All this, my dear," said I. "It must be very good of Mrs. Jellyby to take such pains about a scheme for the benefit of natives, and yet Peepy and the housekeeping." Ada laughed, and put her arm about my neck, as I stood looking at the fire, and told me I was a quiet, dear, good creature, and had won her heart. "You are so thoughtful, Esther," she said, "and yet so cheerful, and you do so much so unpretendingly. You would make a home out of even this house." My simple darling! She was quite unconscious that she only praised herself, and that it was the goodness of her own heart that she made so much of me. "May I ask you a question?" said I, when we had sat before the fire a little while. "500," said Ada. "Your cousin, Mr. Jarndyce. I owe so much to him. Would you mind describing him to me?" Shaking her golden hair, Ada turned her eyes upon me with such laughing wonder, that I was full of wonder too, partly at her beauty, partly at her surprise. "Esther," she cried, "my dear, you want a description of my cousin Jarndyce?" "My dear, I never saw him." "And I never saw him," returned Ada. Well, to be sure! No, she had never seen him. Young as she was when her mamma died, she remembered how the tears would come into her eyes when she spoke of him, and of the noble generosity of his character, which she had said was to be trusted above all earthly things, and Ada trusted it. Her cousin Jarndyce had written to her a few months ago, a plain, honest letter, Ada said, proposing the arrangement we were now to enter on, and telling her that, in time, it might heal some of the wounds made by the miserable Chancery suit. She had replied, gratefully accepting his proposal. Richard had received a similar letter, and had made a similar response. He had seen Mr. Jarndyce once, but only once, 5 years ago, at Winchester School. He had told Ada, when they were leaning on the screen before the fire, where I found them, that he recollected him as a bluff, rosy fellow. This was the utmost description Ada could give me. It set me thinking so, that when Ada was asleep, I still remained before the fire, wondering and wondering about Bleak House, and wondering that yesterday morning should seem so long ago. I don't know where my thoughts had wandered when they were recalled by a tap at the door. I opened it softly, and found Miss Jellyby shivering there, with a broken candle in a broken candlestick in one hand, and an egg cup in the other. "Good night," she said very sulkily. "Good night," said I. "May I come in?" she shortly and unexpectedly asked me in the same sulky way. "Certainly," said I. "Don't wake Miss Clare." She would not sit down, but stood by the fire dipping her inky middle finger in the egg cup, which contained vinegar, and smearing it over the ink stains on her face, frowning the whole time, and looking very gloomy. "I wish Africa was dead," she said on a sudden. I was going to remonstrate. "I do," she said. "Don't talk to me, Miss Summerson. I hate it and detest it. It's a beast." I told her she was tired, and I was sorry. I put my hand upon her head, and touched her forehead, and said it was hot now, but would be cool to-morrow. She still stood, pouting and frowning at me, but presently put down her egg cup, and turned softly towards the bed where Ada lay. "She is very pretty," she said, with the same knitted brow and in the same uncivil manner. I assented with a smile. "An orphan, ain't she?" "Yes." "But knows a quantity, I suppose. Can dance, play music, and sing. She can talk French, I suppose, and do geography, and globes, and needlework, and everything." "No doubt," said I. "I can't," she returned. "I can't do anything hardly, except write. I'm always writing for ma. I wonder you two were not ashamed of yourselves to come in this afternoon and see me able to do nothing else. It was like your ill nature. Yet you think yourselves very fine, I dare say." I could see that the poor girl was near crying, and I resumed my chair without speaking, and looked at her, I hope, as mildly as I felt towards her. "It's disgraceful," she said. "You know it is. The whole house is disgraceful. The children are disgraceful. I'm disgraceful. Pa's miserable. And no wonder. Priscilla drinks. She's always drinking. It's a great shame and a great story of you, if you say you didn't smell her to-day. It was as bad as a public house, waiting at dinner. You know it was." "My dear, I don't know it," said I. "You do," she said very shortly. "You shan't say you don't. You do." "Oh, my dear," said I, "if you won't let me speak." "You're speaking now. You know you are. Don't tell stories, Miss Summerson." "My dear," said I, "as long as you won't hear me out." "I don't want to hear you out." "Oh, yes, I think you do," said I, "because that would be so very unreasonable. I did not know what you tell me, because the servant did not come near me at dinner, but I don't doubt what you tell me, and I am sorry to hear it." "You needn't make a merit of that," said she. "No, my dear," said I, "that would be very foolish." She was still standing by the bed, and now stooped down, but still with the same discontented face, and kissed Ada. That done, she came softly back and stood by the side of my chair. Her bosom was heaving in a distressful manner that I pitied her, but I thought it was better not to speak. "I wish I was dead," she broke out. "I wish we were all dead. It would be a great deal better for us." In a moment afterwards she knelt on the ground at my side, hid her face in my dress, passionately begged my pardon, and wept. I comforted her, and would have raised her, but she cried, "No, no." She wanted to stay there. "You used to teach girls," she said. "If you could only have taught me, I could have learned from you. I am so very miserable, and I like you so much." I could not persuade her to sit by me, or to do anything but move a ragged stool to where she was kneeling, and take that, and still hold my dress in the same manner. By degrees the poor tired girl fell asleep, and then I contrived to raise her head so that it should rest on my lap, and to cover us both with shawls. The fire went out, and all night long she slumbered thus before the ashy grate. At first I was painfully awake, and vainly tried to lose myself, with my eyes closed, among the scenes of the day. At length, by slow degrees, they became indistinct and mingled. I began to lose the identity of the sleeper resting on me. Now it was Ada, now one of my old Reading friends from whom I could not believe I had so recently parted. Now it was the little mad woman worn out with curtsying and smiling. Now some one in authority at Bleak House. Lastly it was no one, and I was no one. The purblind day was feebly struggling with the fog when I opened my eyes to encounter those of a dirty-faced little spectre fixed upon me. Peepy had scaled his crib and crept down in his bedgown and cap, and was so cold that his teeth were chattering as if he had cut them all. End of chapter 4.
This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 5, A Morning Adventure. Although the morning was raw, and although the fog still seemed heavy, I say seemed, for the windows were so encrusted with dirt that they would have made midsummer sunshine dim, I was sufficiently forewarned of the discomfort within doors at that early hour, and sufficiently curious about London, to think it a good idea on the part of Miss Jellyby when she proposed that we should go out for a walk. "Ma won't be down for ever so long," she said, "and then it's a chance if breakfast's ready for an hour afterwards. They dawdle so. As to Pa, he gets what he can, and goes to the office. He never has what you would call a regular breakfast. Priscilla leaves him out the loaf in some milk, when there is any, overnight. Sometimes there isn't any milk, and sometimes the cat drinks it. But I'm afraid you must be tired, Miss Summerson, and perhaps you would rather go to bed." "I am not at all tired, my dear," said I, "and would much prefer to go out." "If you're sure you would," returned Miss Jellyby, "I'll get my things on." Ada said she would go too, and was soon astir. I made a proposal to Peepy, in default of being able to do anything better for him, that he should let me wash him, and afterward lay him down on my bed again. To this he submitted with the best grace possible, staring at me during the whole operation, as if he never had been, and never could again be, so astonished in his life. Looking very miserable also, certainly, but making no complaint, and going snugly to sleep as soon as it was over. At first I was in two minds about taking such a liberty, but I soon reflected that nobody in the house was likely to notice it. What with the bustle of dispatching Peepy, and the bustle of getting myself ready and helping Ada, I was soon quite in a glow. We found Miss Jellyby trying to warm herself at the fire in the writing-room, which Priscilla was then lighting with a smutty parlour candlestick, throwing the candle in to make it burn better. Everything was just as we had left it last night, and was evidently intended to remain so. Below stairs the dinner cloth had not been taken away, but had been left ready for breakfast. Crumbs, dust, and waste paper were all over the house. Some pewter pots and a milk can hung on the area railings. The door stood open, and we met the cook round the corner coming out of a public house, wiping her mouth. She mentioned, as she passed us, that she had been to see what o'clock it was. But before we met the cook, we met Richard, who was dancing up and down Tavies Inn to warm his feet. He was agreeably surprised to see us stirring so soon, and said he would gladly share our walk. So he took care of Ada, and Miss Jellyby and I went first. I may mention that Miss Jellyby had relapsed into her sulky manner, and that I really should not have thought she liked me much, unless she had told me so. "Where would you wish to go?" she asked. "Anywhere, my dear," I replied. "Anywhere's nowhere," said Miss Jellyby, stopping perversely. "Let us go somewhere at any rate," said I. "You needn't laugh, Miss Summerson. You wouldn't like it yourself. You call yourself very good-tempered." "Really, I don't, my dear," said I. "You do. You know you do, Miss Summerson. Don't say you don't. You do. I beg your pardon. I mean you are," she said with quick and yet grudging concession. "Don't be angry with me, dear. I am so provoked." She then walked me on very fast. "I don't care," she said. "Now you are my witness, Miss Summerson. I say I don't care. But if he was to come to our house with his great shiny, lumpy forehead night after night, till he was old as Methuselah, I wouldn't have anything to say to him. Such asses as he and Ma make of themselves." "My dear," I remonstrated, in allusion to the epithet, and the vigorous emphasis Miss Jellyby set upon it. "Your duty as a child." "Oh, don't talk of duty as a child, Miss Summerson. Where's ma's duty as a parent? All made over to the public in Africa, I suppose. Then let the public in Africa show duty as a child. It's much more their affair than mine. You are shocked, I dare say. Very well, so am I shocked too. We are both shocked, and there's an end of it." She walked me on faster yet. "But for all that, I say again, he may come and come and come, and I won't have anything to say to him. I can't bear him. If there's any stuff in the world that I hate and detest, it's the stuff he and ma talk. I wonder the very paving stones opposite our house can have the patience to stay there and be a witness to such inconsistencies and contradictions as all that sounding nonsense, and ma's management." I could not but understand her to refer to Mr. Quayle, the young gentleman who had appeared after dinner yesterday. I was saved the disagreeable necessity of pursuing the subject by Richard and Ada coming up at a round pace, laughing, and asking us if we meant to run a race. Thus interrupted, Miss Jellyby became silent and walked moodily on at my side, while I admired the long succession and varieties of streets, the quantity of people already going to and fro, the number of vehicles passing and repassing, the busy preparations in the setting forth of shop windows and the sweeping out of shops, and the extraordinary creatures in rags, secretly groping among the swept-out rubbish for pins and other refuse. "So, cousin," said the cheerful voice of Richard to Ada behind me, "we are never to get out of Chancery. We have come by another way to our place of meeting yesterday. And by the Great Seal, here's the old lady again." Truly, she was immediately in front of us, curtsying and smiling, and saying, with her yesterday's air of patronage, "The Wards in Jarndyce! Very happy, I am sure." "You are out early, ma'am," said I, as she curtsied to me. "Yes, I usually walk here early, before the court sits. It's retired. I collect my thoughts here for the business of the day," said the old lady mincingly. "The business of the day requires a great deal of thought. Chancery justice is so very difficult to follow." "Who's this, Miss Summerson?" whispered Miss Jellyby, drawing my arm tighter through her own. The little old lady's hearing was remarkably quick. She answered for herself directly. "A suitor, my child, at your service. I have the honour to attend court regularly. With my document. Have I the pleasure of addressing another of the youthful parties in Jarndyce?" said the old lady, recovering herself with her head on one side, and from a very low curtsy. Richard, anxious to atone for the thoughtlessness of yesterday, good-naturedly explained that Miss Jellyby was not connected with the suit. "Ha!" said the old lady. "She does not expect a judgment? She will still grow old, but not so old. Oh dear, no. This is the garden of Lincoln's Inn. I call it my garden. It is quite a bower in the summer time. When the birds sing melodiously, I pass the greater part of the long vacation here, in contemplation. You find the long vacation exceedingly long, don't you?" We said yes, as she seemed to expect us to say so. "When the leaves are falling from the trees, and there are no more flowers in bloom to make up into nosegays for the Lord Chancellor's court," said the old lady, "the vacation is fulfilled, and the sixth seal, mentioned in the Revelations, again prevails. Pray come and see my lodging. It will be a good omen for me. Youth and hope and beauty are very seldom there. It is a long, long time since I had a visit from either." She had taken my hand, and leading me and Miss Jellyby away, beckoned Richard and Ada to come too. I did not know how to excuse myself, and looked to Richard for aid. As he was half amused and half curious, and all in doubt how to get rid of the old lady without offence, she continued to lead us away, and he and Ada continued to follow, our strange conductress informing us all the time, with much smiling condescension, that she lived close by. It was quite true, as it soon appeared. She lived so close by that we had not time to have done humouring her for a few minutes before she was at home. Slipping us out at a little side gate, the old lady stopped most unexpectedly in the narrow back street, part of some courts and lanes immediately outside the wall of the inn, and said, "This is my lodging. Pray walk up." She had stopped at a shop over which was written, "Crook, Rag and Bottle Warehouse." Also, in long thin letters, "Crook, Dealer in Marine Stores." In one part of the window was a picture of a red paper mill, at which a cart was unloading a quantity of sacks of old rags. In another was the inscription, "Bones Bought." In another, "Kitchen Stuff Bought." In another, "Old Iron Bought." In another, "Waste Paper Bought." In another, "Ladies' and Gentlemen's Wardrobes Bought." Everything seemed to be bought and nothing to be sold there. In all parts of the window were quantities of dirty bottles, blacking bottles, medicine bottles, ginger beer and soda water bottles, pickle bottles, wine bottles, ink bottles. I am reminded, by mentioning the latter, that the shop had, in several particulars, the air of being in a legal neighbourhood, and of being, as it were, a dirty hanger-on and disowned relation of the law. There were a great many ink bottles. There was a little tottering bench of shabby old volumes outside the door, labelled "Law Books," all at 9d. Some of the inscriptions I have enumerated were written in law hand, like the papers I had seen in Kenji and Carboy's office, and the letter I had so long received from the firm. Among them was one, in the same writing, having nothing to do with the business of the shop, but announcing that a respectable man, aged 45, wanted engrossing or copying to execute with neatness and dispatch. Address to Nemo, care of Mr. Crook within. There were several second-hand bags, blue and red, hanging up. A little way within the shop door lay heaps of old crackled parchment scrolls and discoloured and dog-eared law papers. I could have fancied that all the rusty keys, of which there must have been hundreds huddled together as old iron, had once belonged to doors of rooms or strong chests in lawyers' offices. The litter of rags tumbled partly into and partly out of a one-legged wooden scale, hanging without any counterpoise from a beam, might have been counsellors' bands and gowns torn up. One had only to fancy, as Richard whispered to Ada and me while we all stood looking in, that yonder bones in a corner, piled together and picked very clean, were the bones of clients, to make the picture complete. As it was still foggy and dark, and as the shop was blinded besides by the wall of Lincoln's Inn, intercepting the light within a couple of yards, we should not have seen so much but for a lighted lantern that an old man in spectacles and a hairy cap was carrying about in the shop. Turning toward the door, he now caught sight of us. He was short, cadaverous, and withered, with his head sunk sideways between his shoulders, and the breath issuing in visible smoke from his mouth, as if he were on fire within. His throat, chin, and eyebrows were so frosted with white hairs, and so gnarled with veins and puckered skin, that he looked from his breast upward like some old root in a fall of snow. "Hi, hi," said the old man, coming to the door. "Have you anything to sell?" We naturally drew back and glanced at our conductress, who had been trying to open the house door with a key she had taken from her pocket, and to whom Richard now said that, as we had had the pleasure of seeing where she lived, we would leave her, being pressed for time. But she was not to be so easily left. She became so fantastically and pressingly earnest in her entreaties that we would walk up and see her apartment for an instant, and was so bent in her harmless way on leading me in as part of the good omen she desired, that I, whatever the others might do, saw nothing for it but to comply. I suppose we were all more or less curious, at any rate, when the old man added his persuasions to hers, and said, "Ay, ay, please her, it won't take a minute. Come in, come in. Come in through the shop, if the other door's out of order." And we all went in, stimulated by Richard's laughing encouragement, and relying on his protection. "My landlord, Krook," said the old lady, condescending to him from her lofty station, as she presented him to us. "He is called among the neighbours the Lord Chancellor. His shop is called the Court of Chancery. He is a very eccentric person. He is very odd. Oh, I assure you, he is very odd." She shook her head a great many times, and tapped her forehead with her finger, to express to us that we must have the goodness to excuse him. "For he is a little, said the old lady with great stateliness. The old man overheard and laughed. "'Tis true enough," he said, going before us with the lantern, "that they call me the Lord Chancellor, and call my shop Chancery. And why do you think they call me the Lord Chancellor, and my shop Chancery?" "I don't know, I am sure," said Richard, rather carelessly. "You see," said the old man, stopping and turning round. Hi, here's lovely hair. I have got 3 sacks of ladies' hair below, but none so beautiful and fine as this. What colour, and what texture!" "That'll do, my good friend," said Richard, strongly disapproving of his having drawn one of Ada's tresses through his yellow hand. "You can admire as the rest of us do, without taking that liberty." The old man darted at him a sudden look, which even called my attention from Ada, who, startled and blushing, was so remarkably beautiful that she seemed to fix the wandering attention of the little old lady herself. But as Ada interposed and laughingly said she could only feel proud of such genuine admiration, Mr. Krook shrunk into his former self as suddenly as he had leaped out of it. "You see, I have so many things here," he resumed, holding up the lantern, "of so many kinds, and all as the neighbours think, but they know nothing, wasting away and going to rack and ruin, and that's why they have given me and my place a christening. And I have so many old parchmentses and papers in my stock, and I have a liking for rust and must and cobwebs, and all's fish that comes to my net, and I can't bear to part with anything I once lay hold of, or so my neighbours think, but what do they know? Or to alter anything, or to have any sweeping, nor scouring, nor cleaning, nor repairing going on about me. That's the way I got the ill name of Chancery. I don't mind. I go to see my noble and learned brother pretty well every day, when he sits in the inn. He don't notice me, but I notice him. There's no great odds betwixt us. We both grub on in a muddle. Hi, Lady Jane!" A large grey cat leapt from some neighbouring shelf on his shoulder, and startled us all. "Hi, show 'em how you scratch. "Ay, tear, my lady," said her master. The cat leaped down and ripped at a bundle of rags with her tigerish claws, with a sound that it set my teeth on edge to hear. "She'll do as much for anyone I was to set her on," said the old man. "I deal in catskins among other general matters, and hers was offered to me. It's a very fine skin, as you may see, but I didn't have it stripped off. That weren't like chancery practice, though," says you. He had by this time led us across the shop, and now opened a door in the back part of it, leading to the house entry. As he stood with his hand upon the lock, the little old lady graciously observed to him before passing out, "That will do, Crook. You mean well, but are tiresome. My young friends are pressed for time. I have none to spare myself, having to attend court very soon. My young friends are the wards in Jarndyce." "Jarndyce," said the old man with a start. "Jarndyce and Jarndyce, the great suit, Crook," returned his lodger. "Hi!" exclaimed the old man in a tone of thoughtful amazement, and with a wider stare than before. "Think of it!" He seemed so rapt all in a moment, and looked so curiously at us, that Richard said, "Why, you appear to trouble yourself a good deal about the causes before your noble and learned brother, the other chancellor." "Yes," said the old man abstractedly. "Sure, your name now will be Richard Carstone." "Carstone," he repeated, slowly checking off that name upon his forefinger, and each of the others he went on to mention upon a separate finger. "Yes, there was the name of Barbary, and the name of Clare, and the name of Dedlock too, I think." "He knows as much of the cause as the real salaried chancellor," said Richard, quite astonished, to Ada and me. "Ay," said the old man, coming slowly out of his abstraction. "Yes, Tom Jarndyce. You'll excuse me, being related, but he was never known about court by any other name, and was as well known there as she is now," nodding slightly at his lodger. "Tom Jarndyce was often in here. He got into a restless habit of strolling about when the cause was on or expected, talking to the little shopkeepers and telling 'em to keep out of chancery, whatever they did. 'For,' says he, 'it's being ground to bits in a slow mill. It's being roasted at a slow fire. It's being stung to death by single bees. It's being drowned by drops. It's going mad by grains.' He was as near making away with himself, just where the young lady stands, as near could be." We listened with horror. "He come in at the door," said the old man, slowly pointing an imaginary track along the shop, "on the day he did it. The whole neighbourhood had said for months before that he would do it, of a certainty, sooner or later. He come in at the door that day, and walked along there, and sat himself on a bench that stood there, and asked me, you'll judge I was a mortal sight younger then, to fetch him a pint of wine. 'For,' says he, 'Crook, I am much depressed. My cause is on again, and I think I'm nearer judgment than I ever was.' I hadn't a mind to leave him alone, and I persuaded him to go to the tavern over the way there, to the other side my lane, I mean Chancery Lane, and I followed and looked in at the window, and saw him, comfortable as I thought in the armchair by the fire, and company with him. I hadn't hardly got back here when I heard a shot go echoing and rattling right away into the inn. I ran out. Neighbours ran out. 20 of us cried at once, 'Tom Jarndyce!'" The old man stopped,
looked hard at us, looked down into the lantern, blew the light out, and shut the lantern up. We were right, I needn't tell the present hearers. Hi! To be sure, how the neighbourhood poured into court that afternoon while the cause was on. How my noble and learned brother, and all the rest of 'em, grubbed and muddled away as usual, and tried to look as if they hadn't heard a word of the last fact in the case, or as if they had, oh dear me, nothing at all to do with it, if they had heard of it by any chance. Ada's colour had entirely left her, and Richard was scarcely less pale. Nor could I wonder, judging even from my emotions, and I was no party in the suit, that to hearts so untried and fresh, it was a shock to come into the inheritance of a protracted misery, attended in the minds of many people with such dreadful recollections. I had another uneasiness in the application of the painful story to the poor half-witted creature who had brought us there. But to my surprise, she seemed perfectly unconscious of that, and only led the way upstairs again, informing us, with the toleration of a superior creature for the infirmities of a common mortal, that her landlord was a little, you know. She lived at the top of the house, in a pretty large room, from which she had a glimpse of Lincoln's Inn Hall. This seemed to have been her principal inducement originally for taking up her residence there. She could look at it, she said, in the night, especially in the moonshine. Her room was clean, but very, very bare. I noticed the scantiest necessaries in the way of furniture. A few old prints from books, of chancellors and barristers, wafered against the wall, and some half-dozen reticules and work-bags, containing documents, as she informed us. There were neither coals nor ashes in the grate, and I saw no article of clothing anywhere, nor any kind of food. Upon a shelf in an open cupboard were a plate or two, a cup or two, and so forth, but all dry and empty. There was a more affecting meaning in her pinched appearance, I thought, as I looked round, than I had understood before. "Extremely honoured, I am sure," said our poor hostess, with the greatest suavity, "by this visit from the Wards and Jarndyce, and very much indebted for the omen. It is a retired situation, considering I am limited as to situation, in consequence of the necessity of attending on the Chancellor. I have lived here many years. I pass my days in court, my evenings and my night here. I find the nights long, for I sleep but little and think much. That is, of course, unavoidable, being in Chancery. I am sorry I cannot offer chocolate. I expect a judgment shortly, and shall then place my establishment on a superior footing. At present, I don't mind confessing to the Wards and Jarndyce, in strict confidence, that I sometimes find it difficult to keep up a genteel appearance. I have felt the cold here. I have felt something sharper than cold. It matters very little. Pray excuse the introduction of such mean topics." She partly drew aside the curtain of the long, low garret window, and called our attention to a number of bird cages hanging there, some containing several birds. There were larks, linnets, and goldfinches. I should think at least 20. "I began to keep the little creatures," she said, "with an object that the Wards will readily comprehend, with the intention of restoring them to liberty, when my judgment should be given. Yes, they die in prison, though. Their lives, poor silly things, are so short in comparison with Chancery proceedings, that one by one the whole collection has died over and over again. I doubt, do you know, whether one of these, though they are all young, will live to be free. Very mortifying, is it not? Although she sometimes asked a question, she never seemed to expect a reply, but rambled on as if she were in the habit of doing so, when no one but herself was present. Indeed, she pursued, I positively doubt sometimes, I do assure you, whether, while matters are still unsettled, and the sixth or great seal still prevails, I may not one day be found lying stark and senseless here, as I have found so many birds. Richard, answering what he saw in Ada's compassionate eyes, took the opportunity of laying some money, softly and unobserved, on the chimney-piece. We all draw nearer to the cages, feigning to examine the birds. I can't allow them to sing much, said the little old lady, for, you'll think this curious, I find my mind confused by the idea that they are singing while I am following the arguments in court. And my mind requires to be so very clear, you know. Another time I'll tell you their names, not at present, on a day of such good omen. They shall sing as much as they like, in honour of youth. A smile and a curtsy. Hope, a smile and curtsy. And beauty, a smile and curtsy. There, we'll let in the full light. The birds began to stir and chirp. I cannot admit the air freely, said the little old lady. The room was close, and would have been the better for it, because the cat you saw downstairs, called Lady Jane, is greedy for their lives. She crouches on the parapet outside for hours and hours, I have discovered, whispering mysteriously, that her natural cruelty is sharpened by a jealous fear of their regaining their liberty, in consequence of the judgment I expect being given shortly. She is sly and full of malice. I half believe sometimes that she is no cat, but the wolf of the old saying. It is so very difficult to keep her from the door. Some neighbouring bells, reminding the poor soul that it was 9:30, did more for us in the way of bringing our visit to an end than we could easily have done for ourselves. She hurriedly took up her little bag of documents, which she had laid upon the table on coming in, and asked if we were also going into court. On our answering no, and that we would on no account detain her, she opened the door to attend us downstairs. Which, with such an omen, it is even more necessary than usual I should be there before the Chancellor comes in, she said, for he might mention my case the first thing. I have a presentiment that he will mention it the first thing this morning. She stopped to tell us, in a whisper, as we were going down, that the whole house was filled with strange lumber which her landlord had bought piecemeal and had no wish to sell, in consequence of being a little This was on the first floor, but she had made a previous stoppage on the second floor, and had silently pointed at a dark door there. The only other lodger, she now whispered in explanation, a law writer. The children in the lanes here say he has sold himself to the devil. I do not know what he can have done with the money. Hush! She appeared to mistrust that the lodger might hear her, even there, and repeating, hush, went before us on tiptoe, as though even the sound of her footsteps might reveal to him what she had said. Passing through the shop on our way out, as we had passed through it on our way in, we found the old man storing a quantity of packets of waste paper in a kind of well in the floor. He seemed to be working hard, with the perspiration standing on his forehead, and had a piece of chalk by him, with which, as he put each separate package or bundle down, he made a crooked mark on the panelling of the wall. Richard and Ada and Miss Jellyby and the little old lady had gone by him, and I was going, when he touched me on the arm to stay me, and chalked the letter J upon the wall, in a very curious manner, beginning with the end of the letter, and shaping it backward. It was a capital letter, not a printed one, but just such a letter as any clerk in Messrs. Kenji and Carboy's office would have made. "Can you read it?" he asked me with a keen glance. "Surely," said I. "It's very plain." "What is it?" "J." With another glance at me, and a glance at the door, he rubbed it out, and turned an A in its place, not a capital letter this time, and said, "What's that?" I told him. He then rubbed that out, and turned the letter R, and asked me the same question. He went on quickly until he had formed, in the same curious manner, beginning at the ends and bottom of the letters, the word Jarndyce, without once leaving two letters on the wall together. "What does that spell?" he asked me. When I told him, he laughed. In the same odd way, yet with the same rapidity, he then produced singly, and rubbed out singly, the letters forming the words Bleak House. These, in some astonishment, I also read, and he laughed again. "Hi!" said the old man, laying aside the chalk. "I have a turn for copying from memory, you see, miss, though I can neither read nor write." He looked so disagreeable, and his cat looked so wickedly at me, as if I were a blood relation of the birds upstairs, that I was quite relieved by Richard's appearing at the door and saying, "Miss Summerson, I hope you are not bargaining for the sale of your hair. Don't be tempted. 3 sacks below are quite enough for Mr. Crook." I lost no time in wishing Mr. Crook good morning, and joining my friends outside, where we parted with the little old lady, who gave us her blessing with great ceremony, and renewed her assurance of yesterday in reference to her intention of settling estates on Ada and me. Before we finally turned out of those lanes, we looked back and saw Mr. Crook standing at his shop door, in his spectacles, looking after us, with his cat upon his shoulder, and her tail sticking up on one side of his hairy cap like a tall feather. "Quite an adventure for a morning in London," said Richard with a sigh. "Ah, cousin, cousin, it's a weary world, this Chancery." "It is to me, and has been ever since I can remember," returned Ada. "I am sure." "To me too," said Richard thoughtfully. "If the Lord Chancellor would decide against my interest as far as that is concerned, or at least would say I was only entitled to—" "How much could you and I live on, Esther?" said Ada, blushing. "No," cried Richard, "he had better decide against me. I can go anywhere, go for a soldier, if that's all, and never be missed. I would sell my best chance, if I could, on the shortest notice and the lowest terms." "And go abroad?" said Ada. "Yes. To India, perhaps?" "Why, yes, I think so," returned Richard. "I have not thought about it," said Ada. "I am only grieved that I should be the enemy, as I suppose I am, of a great number of relations and others, and that they should be my enemies, as I suppose they are, and that we should all be ruining one another without knowing how or why, and be in constant doubt and discord all our lives. It seems very strange, as there must be right somewhere, that an honest judge in real earnest has not been able to find out through all these years where it is." "Ah, cousin," said Richard,
Strange indeed, all this wasteful, wanton chess-playing is very strange. To see that composed court yesterday jogging on so serenely, and to think of the wretchedness of the pieces on the board, gave me the headache and the heartache both together. My head ached with wondering how it happened, if men were neither fools nor rascals, and my heart ached to think they could possibly be either. But at all events, Ada. I may call you Ada. Of course you may, Cousin Richard. At all events, Chancery will work none of its bad influences on us. We have happily been brought together, thanks to our good kinsman, and it can't divide us now. Never, I hope, Cousin Richard, said Ada gently. Miss Jellyby gave my arm a squeeze, and me a very significant look. I smiled in return, and we made the rest of the way back very pleasantly. In half an hour after our arrival, Mrs. Jellyby appeared, and in the course of an hour the various things necessary for breakfast straggled one by one into the dining-room. I do not doubt that Mrs. Jellyby had gone to bed and got up in the usual manner, but she presented no appearance of having changed her dress. She was greatly occupied during breakfast, for the morning's post brought a heavy correspondence relative to Borrioboola, which would occasion her, she said, to pass a busy day. The children tumbled about and notched memoranda of their accidents in their legs, which were perfect little calendars of distress. And Peepy was lost for an hour and a half and brought home from Newgate Market by a policeman. The equable manner in which Mrs. Jellyby sustained both his absence and his restoration to the family circle surprised us all. She was by that time perseveringly dictating to Caddy, and Caddy was fast relapsing into that inky condition in which we had found her. At 1 o'clock an open carriage arrived for us, and a cart for our luggage. Mrs. Jellyby charged us with many remembrances to her good friend, Mr. Jarndyce. Caddy left her desk to see us depart, kissing me in the passage, and stood biting her pen and sobbing on the steps. Peepy, I am happy to say, was asleep and spared the pain of separation. I was not without misgivings that he had gone to Newgate Market in search of me. And all the other children got up behind the barouche and fell off, and we saw them with great concern, scattered over the surface of Tavy's Inn as we rolled out of its precincts. End of chapter 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 6. Quite at Home. The day had brightened very much, and still brightened as we went westward. We went our way through the sunshine and the fresh air, wondering more and more at the extent of the streets, the brilliancy of the shops, the great traffic, and the crowds of people whom the pleasanter weather seemed to have brought out like many-coloured flowers. By and by we began to leave the wonderful city and to proceed through suburbs which, of themselves, would have made a pretty large town, in my eyes. And at last we got into a real country road again, with windmills, rickyards, milestones, farmers' wagons, scents of old hay, swinging signs and horse troughs, trees, fields, and hedgerows. It was delightful to see the green landscape before us and the immense metropolis behind. And when a wagon with a train of beautiful horses, furnished with red trappings and clear-sounding bells, came by us with its music,
I believe we could all three have sung to the bells, so cheerful were the influences around. "The whole road has been reminding me of my namesake Whittington," said Richard, "and that wagon is the finishing touch. Hullo! What's the matter?" We had stopped, and the wagon had stopped too. Its music changed as the horses came to a stand, and subsided to a gentle tinkling, except when a horse tossed his head, or shook himself, and sprinkled off a little shower of bell ringing. "Our postilion is looking after the wagoner," said Richard, "and the wagoner is coming back after us. Good day, friend." The wagoner was at our coach door. "Why, here's an extraordinary thing," added Richard, looking closely at the man. "He has got your name, Ada, in his hat." He had all our names in his hat. Tucked within the band were 3 small notes, one addressed to Ada, one to Richard, and one to me. These the wagoner delivered to each of us respectively, reading the names aloud first. In answer to Richard's inquiry from whom they came, he briefly answered, "Master, sir, if you please," and putting on his hat again, which was like a soft bowl, cracked his whip, reawakening his music, and went melodiously away. "Is that Mr. Jarndyce's wagon?" said Richard, calling to our postboy. "Yes, sir," he replied, "going to London." We opened the notes. Each was a counterpart of the other, and contained these words, in a solid, plain hand: "I look forward, my dear, to our meeting easily, and without constraint on either side. I therefore have to propose that we meet as old friends, and take the past for granted. It will be a relief to you possibly, and to me certainly, and so my love to you. John Jarndyce." I had perhaps less reason to be surprised than either of my companions, having never yet enjoyed an opportunity of thanking one who had been my benefactor and sole earthly dependence through so many years. I had not considered how I could thank him, my gratitude lying too deep in my heart for that. But I now began to consider how I could meet him without thanking him, and felt it would be very difficult indeed. The notes revived in Richard and Ada a general impression that they both had, without quite knowing how they came by it, that their cousin Jarndyce could never bear acknowledgments for any kindness he performed, and that, sooner than receive any, he would resort to the most singular expedients and evasions, or would even run away. Ada dimly remembered to have heard her mother tell, when she was a very little child, that he had once done her an act of uncommon generosity, and that on her going to his house to thank him, he happened to see her through a window coming to the door, and immediately escaped by the back gate, and was not heard of for 3 months. This discourse led to a great deal more on the same theme, and indeed it lasted us all day, and we talked of scarcely anything else. If we did, by any chance, diverge into another subject, we soon returned to this, and wondered what the house would be like, and when we should get there, and whether we should see Mr. Jarndyce as soon as we arrived, or after a delay, and what he would say to us, and what we should say to him, all of which we wondered about, over and over again. The roads were very heavy for the horses, but the pathway was generally good, so we alighted and walked up all the hills, and liked it so well that we prolonged our walk on the level ground when we got to the top. At Barnet There were other horses waiting for us, but as they had only just been fed, we had to wait for them too, and got a long fresh walk over a common and an old battlefield before the carriage came up. These delays so protracted the journey that the short day was spent and the long night had closed in before we came to St. Albans, near to which town Bleak House was, we knew. By that time we were so anxious and nervous that even Richard confessed, as we rattled over the stones of the old street, to feeling an irrational desire to drive back again. As to Ada and me, whom he had wrapped up with great care, the night being sharp and frosty, we trembled from head to foot. When we turned out of the town round a corner, and Richard told us that the post-boy, who had for a long time sympathized with our heightened expectation, was looking back and nodding, we both stood up in the carriage, Richard holding Ada lest she should be jolted down, and gazed round upon the open country and the starlit night for our destination. There was a light sparkling on the top of a hill before us, and the driver, pointing to it with his whip and crying, "That's Bleak House," put his horses into a canter and took us forward at such a rate, uphill though it was, that the wheels sent the road drift flying about our heads like spray from a water-mill. Presently we lost the light, presently saw it, presently lost it, presently saw it, and turned into an avenue of trees, and cantered up towards where it was beaming brightly. It was in a window of what seemed to be an old-fashioned house, with 3 peaks in the roof in front, and a circular sweep leading to the porch. A bell was rung as we drew up, and amidst the sound of its deep voice in the still air, and the distant barking of some dogs, and a gush of light from the open door, and the smoking and steaming of the heated horses, and the quickening beating of our own hearts, we alighted in no inconsiderable confusion. "Ada, my love, Esther, my dear, you are welcome. I rejoice to see you. Rick, if I had a hand to spare at present, I would give it you." The gentleman who said these words in a clear, bright, hospitable voice had one of his arms round Ada's waist and the other round mine, and kissed us both in a fatherly way, and bore us across the hall into a ruddy little room, all in a glow with a blazing fire. Here he kissed us again, and opening his arms, made us sit down side by side on a sofa ready drawn out near the hearth. I felt that if we had been at all demonstrative, he would have run away in a moment. "Now, Rick," said he, "I have a hand at liberty. A word in earnest is as good as a speech. I am heartily glad to see you. You are at home. Warm yourself." Richard shook him by both hands with an intuitive mixture of respect and frankness, and only saying, though with an earnestness that rather alarmed me, I was so afraid of Mr. Jarndyce's suddenly disappearing, "You are very kind, sir. We are very much obliged to you," laid aside his hat and coat, and came up to the fire. "And how did you like the ride? And how did you like Mrs. Jellyby, my dear?" said Mr. Jarndyce to Ada. While Ada was speaking to him in reply, I glanced, I need not say with how much interest, at his face. It was a handsome, lively, quick face, full of change and motion, and his hair was a silvered iron grey. I took him to be nearer 60 than 50, but he was upright, hearty, and robust. From the moment of his first speaking to us, his voice had connected itself with an association in my mind that I could not define,